This is a feature of Zoom I've never used before. Done, redirecting. Okay, it seems to be, I guess it's streaming.
David, I had
Okay,
a
seems to be,
pop-up
I
for
guess it's streaming.
Geneva asking me to admit her. David, I had
Okay,
a
seems to be,
pop-up
I
for
guess it's streaming.
asking me to admit her. David, I had
Okay,
a
seems to be,
pop-up
oh
for
dear.
asking me to admit her.
Okay, okay. Well, I, in theory, it's live streaming, so yay. All right, well, let me put our usual intro text in here, and we can get this show on the road. A little creakier out of the door today because uh, Meetup was giving me internal server errors, but David got me in. Let's see. Are we all still audible? You guys hear me? Donald, say something so I can see if I hear you.
Hello, Rick.
Yay, okay, we're good. I've got audio. All right, and we'll start at the end of paragraph 10 and move into paragraph 11 today. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Millennia and Microcosm seminar. This is, oh, I put it wrong in the chat. It's actually week 154. It's week 154, I believe, unless I'm off by one. I'll just make that correction. We've been doing this for a while. That's a lot of weeks. That's 3 years plus we've been doing Millennia Microcosm, and I think we did a half year or more before that on the Kenneth Smith seminar. So this is a going concern. The Millennium Microcosm, for those who are new to it, the Millennium Microcosm seminar is going to run a total of 6 years. It has run 2.5 already, so this is not as unrealistically audacious a plan as it might sound like at first. The first 2 years were focused on the ancient worldview, which is chapter 4 of Kenneth Smith's forthcoming book, Millennia and Microcosm. And that the goal of that chapter is to get us to look at how did people in the classical world envision the world, themselves, society, nature, the gods, and so forth. Not the way that moderns prefer to think of them, but in their own rights, how did ancients see the world? To try to get out of the caricatures and stereotypes and get a sort of, we wanted to get to the point where we could at least haltingly look at, set aside our modern worldview temporarily and evaluate questions from the perspective of the classical worldview. Say, what would Heraclitus or Aristotle or Thales have to say about this topic? What would Plato have to say? To role play, if you will, the ancients. Now we're in a 2-year sequence. I think we're 8 months in now. We're in a 2-year sequence that's talking about the medieval worldview. And in some ways, this one's more challenging, even though it's more recent, because the modern worldview defines itself so much in opposition to the medieval worldview. So the medieval epoch and the worldview associated with it are what moderns scapegoat. Anytime we don't like something about the world the way it is now, we say, well, that's not us. We're innocent. That was the medievals. They did it, and they're bad. So we call them the Dark Age. And we say, well, we're the Enlightened Age. We see things the way they truly are, unlike those poor, ignorant fools. And so what we're trying to do in this second 2-year stint of the seminar is to look at, on the one hand, how did the medievals define themselves in opposition to the classical worldview? What was it about the late stage Roman Empire that they didn't like, that they felt like they simply had to overturn everything and redefine all the core terms and look at the world in a new way? So we've done that. That was in chapters 5 and 6, and now we're starting to get into some of the details of the medieval worldview, talking especially about the tug of war between sort of the genocidal orthodox position, which is that there is only one correct way to look at God and Jesus and salvation and the world and everything else, and everybody who deviates from it is standing between us and the brotherhood of man. So we have to go out with the cross and the sword, and they can either convert or die. But the goal is to eliminate all other religions and have only the one perfect, pure, correct religion, and that will bring about world peace and utopia on earth and all that. That was the official position that all of the military might was behind. But then we also talked about the fact that partially in direct opposition to that, and partially inspired by Jesus and his example, there were all these heretical movements that were closer to Jesus's original message. Love one another, don't pile up wealth, to try to, learn to make do with less, share what you have, create a brotherhood of man the other way, but through understanding, through dialogue. And these people who were constantly popping up throughout the medieval epoch, they represent they're the other on the other end of the tug of war for the identity of the medieval epoch. That is to say, when moderns are mocking the medieval epoch, all we talk about is crusades, inquisitions, genocide, blah blah blah, ignorance, superstition. But we don't ever talk about the other half of the picture, which is all these other spiritualists, monks, nuns, and holy people who are off in monasteries or sitting on the top of pillars in the desert and contemplating the nature of spirituality and man and God and humility and how do we make a better world. And that's every bit as central to the definition of the medieval epoch as the official genocidal supremacist position. So it's a challenge for us. We have to define the medieval epoch in terms of both sides of this tug of war, and in terms of how is it opposed to the classical era, and how much of the way moderns think of the medieval epoch is our own propaganda and scapegoating, right? Peeling off the layers of programming that we've all had, try to figure out who were these people, what are they trying to do. So this is why we're taking a good 2 years on this section. It's going to take some time to dig through all these different things and try to get to the spirit of this worldview. And this is where we are. We're in chapter 7, and we're in paragraph 10. We're most of the way through. We're going to get into paragraph 11 today. So, I see Fred has recommended a book. That's great. We can follow up on that after class. Thank you. So last week we were talking about especially Oedipus. We were talking about Greek tragedy and the concept of tragic inversion. Where did Oedipus go wrong? Why did these things happen to him? Why does Sophocles write the story the way he does? What is the meaning of this story to the Greeks, to the classical worldview? And we're talking about it in part because even though the medievals differ from the ancients and disagree with the ancients in many ways, we're also seeing in chapters 6 and 7 that especially this spiritualist alternative thinker movement that was running throughout the medieval epoch had a lot of things in common with the classical perspective. And so the critique of hubris, and as Fred pointed out last week, thumos, that Sophocles makes in Oedipus, is very close to the critique that the medieval spiritualists have of the tendency of human beings to be too proud of themselves, too angry, too inclined to try to force things to come out the way they want to. In other words, they can read Sophocles' Oedipus and they get a certain amount of the depth of it, and it means something to them, something profound. And it's part of the basis for why these heretical movements keep cropping up, even though the penalty is death. They keep cropping up throughout the medieval epoch because people are like, man, I don't know about this mainstream hierarchy seems awfully proud of itself, and it's piling up wealth for itself, and it's using military might to try to conquer other peoples and even conquer other Christians if it doesn't like them, and this seems Oedipal. It seems like it's full of hubris and thumos, and this is causing not just a reaction against the ancient world and helping to define what it means to be a medieval, but it's reinforcing some of the strife with the central authorities of the medieval epoch. So this is why Kenneth is walking us through this stuff, and this is where we are. For those of you who are just joining us, this is where we left off. I'm going to post again the link to the text for those who just joined since I started giving our little summary here, and we'll dive in here with paragraph 10. Sentences 7 through 10. And we'll talk through these bits. We'll go slowly through this part to ramp up so that those who kind of weren't with us last week can kind of come up to speed. Kenneth writes, and indeed the condition, dysdaimonia, could virtually be defined from Oedipus's singular case as a brash and headstrong miscreant whose character is designed by fate to bring the utmost evils upon himself, wholly by his own actions, and in spite of all that others can do to warn him. And I'm going to pause before we go on. You know, this should be, for those who were here last week, this should be recapitulating some of the themes we were talking about. I'm going to put a comment in here that Phil would put in. I'm going to try to represent his position here, which is we have to be careful as we read this sentence to know that what we're talking about is not the sum total of Oedipus, but Oedipus as he exists in the play Oedipus Tyrannus. Because as Phil always likes to point out, by the time you get to Oedipus at Colonna, which is a later stage in Oedipus's life when he's wandering the world with his staff and is blind, he's moved on from the position we see in Oedipus Tyrannus. He's learned something about himself. He's learned something about hubris, and he's become a kind of uncanny figure to the Greeks. It's as Lady Calamity says, it's kind of like a redemption arc, but not as simple as the modern version of redemption. It's become his arc is now he's become something almost not of this world. He carries with him the mark of the gods and of fate, and he's become this gigantic object lesson about the nature of character and how powerful an influence our character has over us. And this is something that the Christians agree with in the medieval epoch as well. It's something they share with the ancients. This concern about what is inside of us that emerges in these cryptic ways, cryptic but powerful ways, such that a man like Oedipus can have almost all the virtues, but the few things he's missing are enough to turn his life into a disaster. You know, as Aristotle says about magnanimitas in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, you know, some virtues can't achieve their full potential unless they have all the other virtues to support them. And you can generalize that and say there is some extent to which, if there is a suite of virtues you need to have a healthy character, whatever one or two or three that you're missing, if you over focus on a few things and you're missing some, the ones you're missing become the defining story of your life. It's like, yeah, you're a loving person. Yeah, you're a brave person. But if you're weak on truth seeking and self-criticism, then you'll become the kind of loving person that Torquemada was, torturing people to save their souls because you're so sure of yourself and you're not concerned with whether you've got the truth. Like the kind of helicopter mom who won't ever let their kid grow up and is always trying to micromanage all their choices for them. It's love, but it's love without something. It's missing something. And the thing that it's missing twists the virtue into a vice. And this is kind of what happens to Oedipus. I mean, dysdaimonia, you know, like we said last time, the thing about Oedipus is he's a brave man, right? He faces down multiple people at the fort. He doesn't know it's his dad and his dad's retainers, but he faces them down. He's got courage. He faces down the Sphinx. It's a brave thing to do. He's a smart man. He solves the riddle of the Sphinx. And in a way, he has a commitment to the truth, because when he gets the warning from Creon that the oracle at Delphi says that Thebes is cursed, that there is a miasma, and it's because of a past wrong that was done, Oedipus devotes himself as fiercely as he can to finding out what the truth is. And indeed, over the course of the play, it becomes clear that if he would just have been less courageous and devoted to the truth, his life wouldn't have ended in disaster the way it did, but he would not give up the thread that he was pulling. He's like a tragic version of Sherlock Holmes. He will not give up the chase, and the chase ultimately leads to his own demise. As even some people like Tiresias at one point warns him off and goes, "Oh man, I think you'd be happier if you just let this go." And Oedipus says, "No way." And it's a virtue of a sort, right? If it weren't for those virtues, maybe he still would have done all those terrible things, but he wouldn't have then turned around and, you know, destroyed his own life by chasing the truth down to its bitter conclusion. And we see this theme before, right? To a modern, tragedy just means unfortunate. Anything, I stub my toe and it's a tragedy. No matter how comic or ridiculous the circumstances that led to the disaster, or how random, oh, a volcano went off and people died. How tragic. And the Greeks are shaking their heads and spinning in their grave. That is not a tragedy. That's just something unfortunate that happened. Tragedy is about people who are better than we are. They have virtues that are on display in the story and that are prominent and that are driving the story. And the whole point is to illustrate the powers, but also the limitations of virtues. The things that you're missing will come back to bite you. As Creon says, the unheeded thing escapes. That's Creon's quoting the oracle at Delphi. Or as Heraclitus says, he says Homer misunderstood the lessons of the children who were trying to pick lice off each other when they told him, what we see and grasp, these we leave behind, but what we do not see and do not grasp, these we take away with us. And this is the lesson of tragedy. While the parts of ourselves we don't understand, especially our own character, end up putting us into a state of tragic inversion. And in that state of tragic inversion, the more effective we are, the more virtuous we are, the worse the outcome is, because everything's been turned upside down. As the witches say at the beginning of Macbeth, fair is foul and foul is fair. Shakespeare's summation of tragic inversion. Everything's turned inside out. The master digger, whose problem is that he's in a hole, and he tries to solve it by using his mastery, and instead the problem gets worse and the hole gets deeper. He's like, I don't understand. I'm doing the right thing, and somehow my problem is increasing. The Greeks say this is tragedy. Tragedy is that your virtues work against you, and that Oedipus is not just some sort of weird story about some Freudian freak who wants to sleep with his mama and kill his dada. And even Freud says that's not what the play was about. I just took that name from the play, right? Instead, it's a story about all of us. It's a story about the human condition and the dangers of being immortal, in the sense of not having the full picture, making only partly informed decisions, and acting out on parts of your character that you don't understand, so you don't actually know why you did the things that you did. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I first have to apologize that there are workers working in the basement, so I'm going to try to mute myself unless I'm speaking. Yeah, I agree with you that we are human beings, that we are not infinite beings. So the best we have is what we call human wisdom, which is not exactly the cosmic truth, but understanding through us. The problem with human beings is that we have a lot of potentiality, and we were incomplete in a way because we have to navigate the relationship between being and existence. And we are aware of our existence as all animals are aware of their existence. Like if a lion try to get a gazelle, the gazelle is going to try to do their best not to get killed. They are also aware of their existence in a funny way, but we have more possibilities. But that's the problem, is because our awareness of our existence means that we have to navigate the relationship between being, because we are not God, and existence in some sense. And this awareness makes us always have to equivocate between what is the relationship between being and existence. Because I myself, maybe I'm not Oedipus Colonis, I'm not willing to die just to do the right being, because I want to exist as well. That equivocation. I remember telling my sister at one point when I was talking about things, I said, don't mistake my tolerance for the fact that I really like something. So in some sense, care is about, in a way, mediating that relationship and have enough tolerance to live and let live as well as actually liking everybody that you see. You know, I love that guy, I really care for that guy and all that. But tolerance is maybe you might think it's a wishy-washy thing versus care and love. But it is something that's a middle ground that allow us to coexist, to live and let live. I want to live, I want to let you live. I mean, there is a red line at some point where I'm not going to be tolerant at some point, right? So at some point, you're going to say, well, yeah, I'm extremely tolerant, but I was walking down the street. I made my way. I moved aside so you could pass, but when you passed, you pushed me. Look, that's uncalled for. I mean, like, I already gave in and you pushed me aside. So that's across a red line. So I think tolerance is a very, very important issue. Live and let live is a very, very important idea. In fact, I think Hegel understood that, live and let live, because that's how a society, you don't have to love everybody, but you have to let them live as long as you could tolerate them. So you got to move that red line to a point where it's pretty good. You're going to absorb those relationships. That's all I wanted to say. I think don't mistake my tolerance for the fact that I really like somebody. I'm going to let him live, and he's going to hopefully let me live. And so that provides a very broad consensus in the world. That's it, Phil. Off.
Thank you, Phil. There's a couple of, things that just jumped out at me about that. The tolerance thing would have saved Oedipus and his dad, right? It's part of why I got so excited last week when Fred talked about Thumos, because on the one hand, obviously Oedipus is losing his temper left and right in Oedipus Tyrannus. There's all kinds of moments when as you're reading the play, you back out. You're just knocked out of it for a moment to go, geez, man, what the hell? He's like goes, he blows his top repeatedly. But the critical thing, why does he kill his dad at the ford? Because his dad won't give way and let him cross the ford first. First of all, that is incredibly Thumos. I mean, very, very petty, very angry. Me, I. But also, why didn't his dad stand aside and let him cross the ford first? Because his dad is suffering from Thumos. It runs in the damn family, right? This is what we're seeing here. This is one of the best things about the Greeks, right? That there is often very important stuff that isn't being said because they're trusting that you're going to notice it, you're going to pick it up, right? We can't. If Oedipus got his problem from his father Laios, it didn't come from the culture. His dad had no hand in raising him, right? And in fact, we saw Laius's Thumos earlier, when Laius's reaction to the prophecy is to immediately say, "Let's kill the kid." Once again, you're like, "What the hell, man? Jesus!" That is not a normal person's reaction to a scary prophecy. You might say, "Well, the gods have spoken. Evidently, this is what's going to happen. Let's have the best life we can until that happens and do all the good in the world we can. Everybody's got to die someday." It's like, let's raise a good kid. Let's be a good king. But no, he's like, kill the kid. Let's do it. It's like, so where did he get that? Well, he certainly didn't get it from the way that he was cultivated, because he was raised by somebody else far away. He was born into that curse in the same way that I was born into alcoholism. It runs in the genes. There's nothing to be done about it. Except that there is something to be done about it. And this is the other point I wanted to make in response to what Phil said, which I thought, thank you, Phil. You made some excellent points here. The other thing is, the Greek take on free will and determinism is far more sophisticated than anything I've seen in any modern book that discusses the topic. Moderns all want to boil it down to one or the other. Either we're all free or it's all predetermined. That's almost all the arguments about free will versus determinism in the last 500 years have taken one of those two positions. And the only ones that are more sophisticated than that say it's some of both, right? Like you pour a little bit of free will into the bowl and you pour a little bit of determinism and you stir and, voila, you have your recipe. And the Greeks would look at that and say, these are just disturbingly simple-minded takes on the issue. To summarize, in the briefest way possible, the Greek take is that we have both free will and determinism. And that the way they manifest is that our fate at the moment, at any given moment, our fate is predetermined by our character. Character is fate is the usual summation of ethos, anthropoi, daimon from Heraclitus. And what it means is that your character has such a powerful influence on what you even notice in the world around you, what you care about in the world around you, that it constrains your intellect. What questions it occurs to you to ask, you're going to ask about the things that you notice and value and pay attention to. And all that comes from your character. And so, this is why children of alcoholics often inherit the alcoholism. This is why in families with generational cycles of domestic abuse is often passed along. So the character that's formed in you before you first ask your very first philosophical question is already at work in the way that you phrase that question. There's a strong element of determinism, but the Greeks are not determinists. They say, if you don't do anything about your character, then you have no free will. But you can do something about your character. This is the stupid pet trick that Homo sapiens has. You can not just, like Oedipus does, look at the world around you for clues. You can turn your intellect around and look inside yourself at the nature within you, as Heraclitus calls it. Because we're amphibians and we're caught between two infinities, not one infinity. There's the world around us and there's a world within us. And that too can be explored, which is what the Oracle at Delphi is saying when it says Gnothi se autem. Explore the world within, because it is just as binding upon you as the world without. And if you explore the world within, you will discover that just like you can act on the world around you and make changes, are you wet? Why not build a lean-to? You can sit under the lean-to and not be wet. You can change your external contingencies through your agency, right? This is a core part of Greek concept. But where it gets interesting is they say the same is true inside, the nature inside you. You can look around that world and learn how it works, and then you can start to change things. You can cultivate your character. And if character is fate, and then you cultivate your character and change it, then you've just changed your fate. And yeah, granted, the new character that you have is just as binding upon you in this moment as the old character was in the old moment. So on the one hand, again, we're back to predetermination. But on the other hand, we change what the predetermination would be, and that's free will. This is a very interesting, nuanced dialectic that they have. It's a tug of war between free will and determinism. And they say this is the structure of Homo sapiens. This is how our mind works. And they're perfectly comfortable with it. And when they write things, when Sophocles writes something like Oedipus Tyrannus, he's writing with that in mind. He's showing us somebody who, despite Oedipus's commitment to the truth that leads to his destruction in Oedipus Tyrannus, it is only a half-witted search for the truth. He's willing to search around him, but he's not willing to search within himself. Like a lot of moderns, he's very extrinsic, very externalistic. Where is the malefactor? I shall find him and punish him. Even if he's in my own family, I'll punish him. He's thinking outwardly, but he doesn't look inwardly. Who am I? As Stephen points out, the riddle of the Sphinx, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs at night. The true answer in this play is not, and by the way, the play never cites this riddle. It's one of the, it comes from another source. But if that's the riddle, what Oedipus has done by saying, well, the answer is man, who crawls in his youth and stands on 2 legs when he flourishes and eventually needs a walking stick in his old age. As Stephen points out, that's not just a man, Oedipus, that's you. And you're going to be walking with a staff by the end of this play because you'll have taken out your own eyes. And you don't know that's going to happen to you, but the Sphinx does know. Kenneth, by the way, loves the Sphinx. In his books of parables, he talks about the Sphinx repeatedly. He says the Greeks see the Sphinx as as an astonishing supernatural creature that looks into mystery and is comfortable with mysteries. And the greatest mystery is it can look into a human being and read their character as though it's right out in the open in plain print. It looks at Oedipus and it says, your story, you're walking on two legs now, is determined by back when you were on all fours. What happened then is shaping the story of who you are now. And that's why by the end of this play, you're going to be walking with a walking stick. And of course, whoosh, right over Oedipus's head. Amen. But he doesn't get that it's him. Just like over and over, he doesn't ask those questions about the nature within him. And if he'd been raised that way to do that from the beginning, maybe he could have gotten his thumos under control, and maybe he would have behaved differently at the ford and not slain his own father. I mean, all this, there's a kind of tragedy that inherently follows self-blindness. And the Greeks are very suspicious of that particular defect. Dysdaimonia, Kenneth Smith uses the term here in this sentence, and this is similar to Shakespeare knows about this in Othello. The character named Desdemona is named after dysdaimonia. This is a recurring theme in drama. What is the nature of bad character? And what the Greeks are saying here is, if you've got all the other virtues but you're self-blind, that's all it takes to turn your life into a wreck. And not just his life, he wrecks the life of his family, and he wrecks Thebes, right? They're suffering under a miasma for years because of him. So thanks, Phil. John, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So along the lines of this idea of the tragic inversion, if you're missing a couple or even one favorable quality and you have the rest cultivated, those other ones can work against you. And the solution is to try to cultivate that that missing quality. What about the idea of dulling down your other favorable qualities so they're in line with your unfavorable quality? That's kind of another way to work on it, right? Because you were saying if Oedipus didn't have his favorable qualities, his bad quality wouldn't have haunted him.
Yes, that's right. That's right. There is in these issues of free will and determinism, the Greeks see really the explanation for Nietzsche's statement, which he'll make 2,500 years later. But the Greeks are thinking it. There's a reason why Nietzsche says this statement. He's crazy for the Greeks. He's trying to understand the Greek spirit. Kenneth Smith's whole work in this book, following up on trying to explain the ancient worldview, is it follows from Nietzsche. And Nietzsche tried hard to take the Greeks off the pedestal and treat them anthropologically and say, who were they in their own right? Not just who we need them to be for our own propaganda, but who were they in their own right? And so when Nietzsche says power makes stupid, he's not just being a contrarian, he's trying to capture something the Greeks thought, which is, if you have very little power, your vices have very little impact. But if you have a lot of power, your vices have a lot of impact. And it's part of the reason why the Greeks believe that one of the worst thing that can happen to a society is to be ruled by somebody unfit, somebody without sophrosune. But it also comes into play in this element you're talking about, John, with from the Greek perspective, it comes directly into play. The example that we gave, I think it was a year and a half ago that we first talked about this issue. The Greeks believe, Americans like to have a national epic that we're proud of. The revolution. We fought off a superior power. Freedom. We made ourselves free. We came together and we did it. And then since then, it's just been a great march of triumphs, one after another. And I'll never forget how a history teacher of mine said, even in the modern world, not everybody looks at the world that way. The Germans see their history as a great march of catastrophes. Right? One disaster, one avoidable, unnecessary disaster after another, culminating with the Holocaust, right? And that's how they teach their history. They're like, Jesus, we did that. It's not some outsider. It's not some foreigner. It's not some subversive element. It was us. There's something wrong in the German character that led us to do something like that. We did it all together. And we need to understand ourselves and figure out who we are. It's possible to have the kind of introspection that makes one cautious about one's vices, even in the modern world. But disaster strikes the most when you get people who don't understand that they've got a defect and they lean hard into their strengths. It's just like you're saying, they lean hard into the strengths that they have, and kaboom, you get this catastrophe. And the classic example that we like to give in this is that the reason that the Greeks made every Greek, free or slave, read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer was called the Bible of the Greeks. The reason they raised everybody on it over and over was because the story that's told in the Iliad and the Odyssey is not a story of adventure and triumph. We like to tell the story that way because we're moderns and we believe in adventure and triumph, but the Greeks didn't see it that way. They saw it as a story of catastrophe. We had everything going for us. Look at all these heroes of our golden age. They were the descendants of gods. They had not just noble, but divine blood ran in their veins, and they were able to do astonishing things. Hercules, so strong, right? Theseus, so clever and smart. All these people with their Achilles with his courage. And they said, and yet, when you put all these vices together, you get the catastrophe of the Trojan War, which culminated in the downfall of Bronze Age civilization. The Greeks knew that they were clawing their way out of a 500, 600, 700-year dark age in which they'd been illiterate. They lost the ability to read and write. They lost trade. They used to have trade across the continents, and they were reduced down to, scratching in the dirt to try to make a living. And they said, nobody did that to us. We did it to ourselves. There's something in our character that makes us act this way. And if we don't figure out what's wrong with us and do something about it, we're going to do it again. So let's make sure everybody gets the point. We're going to tell this story over and over and over of these mighty people who wrecked everything. Not despite their virtues, but because of their virtues. And the knot that ties the whole Trojan War together from the Greek perspective, and again, moderns never talk about this part, what ties it all together, what they see as the ultimate cause, is that Helen was so beautiful that every man wanted her, every man. And the Greeks realized they were going to have civil war. They were going to tear themselves to pieces with all the kings fighting for who was going to get to marry Helen. And to solve that problem, to make sure that all the kings supported the one who married Helen, Odysseus, so clever, cleverer than any other Greek, he's the smartest of guys, came up with the smartest, cleverest solution, which is all the kings are going to make an oath to the gods on the river Styx, the ultimate authority. We're all going to swear an oath that whoever Helen marries, all the rest of us will support that marriage. And if anybody, us or anybody else, tries to take Helen away from Menelaus, as it turns out, we will all turn on that person. And so it had to be clear to each Greek king, I have no chance, because all the other Greek kings will take me out. So he bound them together in a peace. But the thing about this peace is, the Greeks believe that the world of the home and marriage is private and somewhat shameful. That's the world of animal needs and dependency. You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clothing. They said it's gross that we are so dependent and that we suffer these needs. And the goal is to master that so that you can move out into the second realm, which is the agora, where you can learn a trade. You could be a craftsman. You could ply the seas, and you learn how to negotiate with other people to get the things you need that you can't create in your household, in the oikos. And hopefully somebody in that group learns the further lesson that it's not enough to try to beat the other people, that the purpose, as Aristotle says, the purpose of trade is friendship. It's to create a greater society. And it's only those people who can lift themselves up above that second tier into the third tier who are competent to govern. The ones who can say, it's not about what I need, it's not about what I've been trained to do, it's not about how to get rich, it's about what's the best decision for all of us together. How can we be a healthy organism together and separately at the same time? And only those people should govern. And the Greeks believe these three realms, which, by the way, if you're curious, Hannah Arendt writes about this in her book, The Human Condition. She describes all three of these domains. It's crystal clear writing. It's beautiful writing. It's one of the places that Kenneth got this, according to his what he's told us. So read it. It's a blast. The Greeks believe that these three realms had to be kept separate. It's why slaves couldn't vote. Right? Some of the people who were slaves dressed just as nice as anybody else you could ever meet. They could be highly educated. They could be, walking down the street. The emperor of Persia comes to Greece and he's furious because he can't figure out who's free and who's a slave. They all look the same. They're all treated the same in Athens, right? And the Greeks say, yeah, that's the point. The definition of a slave is that somebody who doesn't get the vote, and the reason they don't get the vote is because they're too scary. If they vote, they're going to vote for their appetites, or they're going to vote for their ideologies. They have not grown up enough to vote for what's good for everybody. And that should be the definition of a slave, nothing more, nothing less, according to the Athenians at the time. Now, the Persian emperor didn't care for that. But so this idea that you have to keep the realms separated from each other, that you don't mix the two. If you understand that the way the Greeks understood it, then you understand that what Oedipus did by binding together the politics of the Mycenaean world with a specific marriage and what goes on in a bedroom and whether somebody cheats on somebody else was the most heinous, evil, heretical thing that you could possibly imagine. By taking the oath on the river Styx and the gods, they literally are tying heaven to the fate of this bedroom. And if Menelaus and Helen can't stay faithful to each other, not just all of the politics of the Greek world, but the entire sacred realm and all of nature are going to be corrupted by this marriage falling apart. Things that should have been separated were tied together into a little wrapper. And as a result, it's like when people talk in America, people talk about separation of church and state. They say one of the big reasons that there's so much corruption in politics, you don't want that in your religion. Even if you want your church to get ahead, you got to think about, don't you want your relationship with Jesus to be clean and pure and noble? Don't you want to hear the still small voice within you? You don't want to be influenced by, I wonder if I can make a bunch of money this way. You don't want to be influenced by, but if I sacrifice this thing, then I'll get a bunch of votes and then I can force my ideas on other people. The goal was to not tie together something that's very corrupting with something that's supposed to be clean and pure. That's the feeling that Greeks had when they read the Iliad. And they read about the clever way that Oedipus thought of a way to prevent the civil war. And the way to prevent the civil war was to destroy Bronze Age civilization by accident with this great oath that never should have happened. So there's these levels to these stories that are obvious to the Greeks and not so obvious to us. And all of this is a follow-on to what John said, because this is dealing with that issue directly. Oedipus was very, very, very smart, but not so wise. If he'd been wise, he never, ever, ever would have suggested that oath. It was a terrible idea, but it was so clever. Nobody but him could have thought of it. If he'd been less intelligent, maybe Bronze Age civilization wouldn't have collapsed and they wouldn't have had to spend 700 years clawing their way out of a dark age. Only Oedipus could have destroyed... I'm sorry, I just said Oedipus, Odysseus. Only Odysseus could have destroyed Bronze Age civilization through his cleverness. His cleverness was preternaturally great. And in the same way, Oedipus is the one, as Stephen puts Oedipus Rex, Oedipus was the one who wrecked Thebes. And he wrecked Thebes because he was smarter than everybody else. He was braver than everybody else. In his half-witted way, he was more truth-seeking than everybody else. And of course, he's afflicted with thumos. The thing inside himself that he can't look at and can't do anything about. So the kinds of questions that John's raising are the kinds of questions the Greeks want us to be asking. What are the different ways that you can balance these virtues off against each other? What are the different ways you can compensate for a vice? There's a whole possible world of strategies in there to be scientifically investigated and documented, hopefully, in a persuasive way, so that the next generation of kids has an easier time. They start out with better stories that make it more obvious what went wrong, and maybe they won't make some of the mistakes that we made. And this is why the Greeks are writing all these tragedies. It's for paideia. They're trying to teach the kids how to do better. So this is what he's talking about in this first sentence. This condition, dysdaimonia, the Greeks are always asking about the character of somebody. When Martin Luther King Jr. says, I dream of a day when my little boys won't be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He's not saying don't judge. He's saying judge by the thing that matters. What is your character? What is inside you that is trying to express itself? And if it's not good, you got to work on that before you should ever want power. Because if you get power, it's going to magnify the negative impact of the problems in your character. I never want to be president. I'm well aware of enough of my defects to know you give me more power, and the reach of those vices will become so strong that my virtues can't rein them in. Because the vices tend to occur in our blind spots where we don't know we're supposed to act. And that's exactly what's happened to Oedipus here. Bringing the utmost evils down upon himself. Utmost, right? Because kinslaying and incest were the two greatest taboos among the Greeks. And that's why they both happened to Oedipus. And that's why it has to be brought on himself. It has to be his own character. And he says, in spite of all that others can do to warn him, next time you read Oedipus Tyrannus, just note each and every moment along the way when somebody tried to warn him. There's over half a dozen of them. He had multiple moments when he could have got it right. All right, so then he continues. That is hamartia in extremis, in its purest or most radical form. Hamartia, we talked about this over the last month. Missing the mark, the archery term, right? You see the target, you aim for the target, you miss the mark. And the Greeks say that's sin. Sin is missing the mark. It's not God gave you an order and he told you he was going to send you to hell if you didn't obey, and you still didn't obey, so you deserve hell. That's not it at all. It's clearly about, to the Greeks, it's clearly about missing the mark. And as somebody pointed out last week, and I don't remember who brought it up, but they were right on, hamartia takes two different forms. One is, that's the right target and I missed the mark. The other is, I hit the mark, but I was aiming for the wrong target. I thought this would be a great idea because I'm a fool. It's a terrible idea. Nobody should accomplish this, but I thought I should, and I did a brilliant job accomplishing it, and now everybody hates me because I wrecked everything. That is also hamartia, right? This isn't about, hamartia is not about being confused. It's not just about not being effective enough, which is the risk of a modern interpreting hamartia. It's not just we tried to hit the mark and we failed. It also includes overconfidence about where the mark is. Right? I aimed for the wrong thing. And this goes back to the theme that the Greeks talk about a lot about Homo sapiens. Sophrosune, all important. Sophrosune, the most important ancient Greek word to the ancient Greeks. Sophrosune, the compass in the brain that every living organism except us has. The acorn never tries to grow into a nettle bush, never tries to become a kitten. It always tries to become an oak. It may succeed, it may fail, but it's always going to try to do the thing that is the right thing for an acorn to do. Same with the cheetah. Same with the algae, but not us. We don't know what the hell the right thing is to do. We're free. And this was the other thing I wanted to say earlier about Phil's first comment, is that the Greeks understand that freedom is a two-edged sword, and not in the way moderns tend to think. We're free, yes, to be more creative and to have more choices. But unfortunately, that means we can choose terrible, terrible things. We can choose things no animal ever ought to choose, but we can't tell the difference. We're guided by our own enthusiasms and our sense of what's reasonable. But human reason is not the same as divine reason or as natural reason. We don't actually, our reasons frequently don't make sense. They make sense to us, but not to nature or not to the gods. Heraclitus says, the human nature has no real understanding. Only the divine nature has it. And he also says, man is not rational. Only what encompasses him, i.e. nature, is rational. They're warning us. Homo sapiens has a problem. Nietzsche says, man is a sick animal. We're an animal that has a tragic flaw. Like being born into an alcoholic family and you have the alcoholic gene and it's not your fault, but you've got it. If you're smart, you'll learn about it. And what does it do to us so that you can be on guard? Philaktos, says Aeschylus. You'll be on guard against its attempts to influence you. And the Greeks say we need to be equally on guard against this thing in us that doesn't know what the right thing is to do, but thinks it does. We are possessed by daimons. Entheos, enthusiasm comes from the phrase entheos, the God within. We are possessed by things, and they make us excited, and they take the place of sophrosune in us. We get highly motivated, and we race in a direction, but we have no idea if that's the right direction or not. Or we may think it is, but we're usually wrong. And this is the problem with the human condition. Nai Islam has a question in the chat, and I'm going to do that one before I do Phil's, because I haven't heard from Nai Islam yet today. Could the very self-awareness that allows us to introspect upon our characters be liable for potentially inflicting the concept of hamartia? If our perspectives are bound by our characters, what dictates whether or not we will pay attention to the right thing, to attune to within ourselves? These are great. These are such Greek questions. Greeks would be proud of you, man. This is the stuff they worry about. This is what they care about. This is what they write tragedies about. They're like, let's dig into this, they say. So yeah, part of an anthropological perspective on this is that through most of human prehistory, about 300,000 years, give or take, our species has been around. Cultures, we don't know where cultures first developed. We don't have any documentation of those early years. We're working through archaeological remains trying to piece together what the cultures might have been. But there is a conclusion that we can reach, which is that through some process, most cultures ended up eventually becoming functional. Over tens of thousands of years, the bad ones were weeded out. The non-viable ones were weeded out. And we were left with cultures that were able to persist. And the way we know is we didn't go extinct, right? I mean, early on, there weren't that many of us. If we had idiots around who are like, I want to win and I'm going to win by killing all the other people, and you hear this sort of thing in the modern world all the time. If people thought like that 300,000 years ago, there wouldn't be any people left. Because it wasn't that hard to chase them all down and kill them. Now there's billions of us and it's a challenge. But back then, when there were only a few thousand of us, it wasn't that big a deal. But evidently nobody wanted to do it. And one of the explanations for why would they be functional, more functional than we are, is to say evolution was operating upon those cultures, right? The ones that didn't work died out. And by process of elimination, you were left with the ones whose cultural ideas were closer to Sophrosune than the ones that died out. And they could all still be really weird in a lot of ways, right? We only had to live long enough to reproduce. But the current evolutionary thinking is that it was more than that. That Homo sapiens as an animal is designed to have a long life, contrary to what people said through most of the 20th century. And the evidence for that has to do with stages of development in which the mother needs to move on from her current child to reproduce and have a new child, while the child is still relatively helpless. And that the way that that's made up for is with the grandmas and the grandpas, with the elderly, and that they take on a bunch of the child rearing roles while the parents are moving on to have another kid. There's all this interesting evaluation in the last 30 years of the stages of development physically that we go through that suggests that there is a cultural evolution that's hardwired into us that was developing at the same time. So maybe these cultures are evolving to have elders, and that the elders are playing critical roles in the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. After all, if if our survival depends upon having a healthy culture to simulate Sophrosune with, then it becomes vitally important our ability to transmit that culture from one generation to the next. If we hit upon a winning combination, we don't want to just lose it because everybody died out before they could explain what they got right. A new generation shouldn't have to start over. They should be able to learn from the previous generation. So the development of language, the development of art, the development of ritual and religion, the development of language, writing, all of these things contribute to this idea of a species that depends upon, by process of elimination, figuring out what works, and then recognizing that it's working and having the ability to pass it on so that the lessons aren't lost. So all of this has been going on for a while in us. And evidently some of it at least is biologically driven. The need for language, for example, the need for elders to pass on culture, apparently. So what that means is that to answer your question tentatively, as Stephen correctly says, don't be too sure of that. And I'm not sure. Nobody's sure about this stuff. We have like very little evidence from the last 300,000 years prior to writing. But it's suggestive of the idea that we're a kind of animal that compensates for the lack of a hardwired Sophrosune, right? Because it's hardwired into the acorn, it's hardwired into the cheetah, but it's not hardwired into us. But the compensation is that we have this appetite for culture. We have this hollow spot inside of us, this aching, yearning emptiness that wants to be filled with something. And we might try to fill it with love. We might try to fill it with, drugs. We might try to fill it with, classic cinema of the 1940s and 50s. But we're looking for something to fill the hole. And that ache is maybe hardwired into us, and it's the ache for culture. Because if we ache enough for culture, then we ache for the kinds of relationships that will allow successful cultures to be passed on to the neighbors and to the children. Maybe that's what we've evolved to do. It's hard to say. But having the answers is less important than asking the questions. Oedipus would have been spared so much pain if he would have asked the questions. So kudos to Nye for the fantastic questions. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you called on me now because I was waiting. I raised my hand. I was hoping that the people working in the basement that's making a lot of noise might be going on a lunch break. So I have an opportunity, maybe. Uh, uh, if not, I'll keep my hands up if it breaks, okay? Because you're saying a lot of things that seems to weave together in my thoughts about all sorts of things. For instance, power makes stupid, which is interesting because I think that's an important factor about an individual. Also, how societies knit together. So an individual is no longer an individual, but a cultural movement. That was important. And also the Sphinx, it just brought me right back to Egypt, that preceded that, because the Sphinx was something that was involved in the Book of the Dead. And so, in some sense, Osiris, of course, and the Last Judgment, in some sense, is weighing the souls and the hearts of individuals. They have to be, that soul and heart have to be as light as the feather to go into the next life through the Book of the Dead, to resurrect itself into another life. That sounds very Christian to me, to, in a sense, be reborn into another life. Of course, this is the life of the dead in the Book of the Dead, but nonetheless, it's a resurrection. And so very, very interesting. And how the self-asune is not just embedded in individuals, but it could capture the entire, not the entire, but a large group of people in a society, in a culture. And I'm going to sing something to you that struck me very much about what's called manifest destiny in the United States. That's a cultural movement, not just an individual movement, cultural movement. The song goes like this. Oh, beautiful for spacious sky, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesty, up above the golden plains. America, America, God bless His grace on thee in brotherhood. Wait a minute.
And crown thy good in
And crown thy good from sea to shining sea. And
Yes.
I'm thinking in brotherhood. How about the American Indians? They're left out.
Yes.
They're not brothers. We're going to overrun them, and we're going to send the cowboys after them, in the Wild West. And so talk about a division. I mean, it's our destiny to run them out of the country. And the brotherhood does not extend beyond that line. And we send the meanest gunslingers out there, and they could do it because they have no heart. They're not going to get into the Book of the Dead. Not that they want to. So in some sense, this group relationship makes a nation also stupid. It's not just power. the seeking of power makes the nation stupid as well as individuals. If it wasn't for a few East Coast literary people and newspaper men, well, we wouldn't have American Indian problem. They'd be gone. The fact that they interfere, say, well, just put them in a reservation, don't have to kill them. I mean, like I guess we reach a compromise, So in some sense, it's very, very interesting that, even the people, I think the Cherokees were the people that actually behaved just like white people. They had property, they had slaves even, okay? And nonetheless, of course, what's his name? Ran them out of town and sent them to Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears, And that's why if you go to a Cherokee reservation, do not spend a $20 bill. They will be very upset because this is a guy that did it to us. Okay. But okay, so I guess there are at least some people in the East Coast at that point that was maybe not loving, but at least had enough tolerance to say, don't kill them all, at least let them live and let live, although not in very good conditions. Okay, that's why I want to say that groups could also run stupid with power. Power makes stupid. Okay, that's what I want to say. And knit it together, of course, the Osiris judging the people that go into resurrection. That sounds a lot like Christianity to me, a pre-runner of Christianity, although they were born into the book of the dead, not the book of life. But nonetheless, that's a precursor. So it seems to knit together all of that in relationship, the Sphinx, the story. So Christianity, in a precursor Christianity already existed in Egypt with the Sphinx. Okay, that's it, Phil. Hey, I succeeded. They did go to lunch.
Well done, Phil. And thank you for the comments. Yeah, Andrew Jackson, not very popular on Indian reservations, that's for sure. Oh, Geneva, excellent. Yes, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, so I know in the 21st century and today that we're all woke and aware of all these things. But if we never made a mistake, how would we ever grow or evolve? I mean, we fucked up some shit. Okay, but I have never gained much of anything without first going over all the wrong roads. And then I think, oh yeah, okay, let's try this one. And it works. And so, okay, sticking to Hegel, there has to be some evolution going on. I can remember as a child, I was not allowed to drink from certain fountains because of who I was. That's not, my granddaughter has no idea what the hell that feels like or what it's going on. So we learn and we grow and we evolve and we adjust. And to me, that seems to be the way life is. I mean, we don't gain much by beating up what the hell we did wrong before. I think we can talk about it and discuss it. But to me, it's more productive to talk about how much we've evolved and where we've evolved to and what we can do. I mean, I am very happy that my granddaughter has no idea what it feels like not to be able to go in Woolworths or not to be able to go to one of the fancy Bullock stores or whatever it was for tea. She doesn't know what that feels like. I do. I don't know what my mother had to go through when she was growing up because of who she was. And to me, that means that we're making progress, maybe not as fast as everybody would like. And it just kind of gets to be a little bit irritating to me when what we're doing is like beating up and talking about all the things that we did wrong. And blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, okay, we're awoke now, supposedly. And we're shifting and going in another direction. But isn't that kind of what life is about and supposed to be about, according to Hegel? We started as a seed, and at some point we may become a tree. But as you've said, Rick, and others have said in this meeting before, we don't know exactly when the seed became a bud and when the bud became a flower. It's somewhere in there. And so I don't think we spend enough time talking about the progress that we've made. And that kind of, it just kind of annoys me a little bit. And I don't like feeling annoyed because I'm the person that you could talk to who's made every goddamn mistake that could be made. But I've also learned a lot. And I think that I've gained some wisdom. I still make a lot of mistakes, but I also have a lot of wisdom. So I think as a society, we're wiser than we were 50 years ago when I couldn't drink from the water fountain. And so, maybe we talk about the steps that we've taken that got it right. That's it.
Thank you, Geneva. Yeah, it's part of what's refreshing for me about Kenneth's take on the medieval period is that usually we talk about the medieval period as just all the terrible things that happened and let's not ever do that again. But Kenneth is talking about it as well in terms of what was their critique against the ancient world that they replaced? What did they not like about the world before them? And how did they propose to make things better? How are they trying to learn lessons going forward? And I'm with you. It's a really interesting dimension of the discussion to try to see the unfolding of the organism. And this is the existentialist theory of history that we see coming out of Hegel, and that's been modified by post-Hegelians. But that idea, what if these are something like stages of development, and we are trying to learn some lessons? And it could be, I'm wildly hypothesizing, it could be that the reason this whole cycle of highly aggressive, nasty cultures has arisen in the last few thousand years is because, as good as they might have been, some of them, the ones that predated this uprising, maybe they had no immune system. They didn't know what to do when something like these cultures came along. And you can imagine in the evolution of multicellular animals that there had to come a stage when we had to develop an immune system. And before that, we were just vulnerable. We might have been cool, might have been nice, but it was just waiting to fall over the first time a stiff breeze came along. This is a hypothesis. That's absolutely not my take. I don't have a take on this, but it's entirely possible that that's the case. That the reason that this represents some kind of progress is we have to explore what this is and figure out how to make a culture that doesn't have to behave like that. And as part of that, yeah, we got to see what did each epoch learn from the previous epoch, what mistakes did it make, and so on. It's why I really enjoy this book. It does what you're talking about. Now, part of what he does in it is that he recognizes that sometimes when we're chucking the bathwater, we also chuck the baby. And so it's where it gets, there's this interesting dialectic. What did the new epoch learn from the old one? How did it improve on it? But also, where did it go wrong where the previous one got some things right? And so you get this kind of tug of war going on. And what you wish is that people would be so open-minded to learning from their own mistakes the way that you're talking about. And I sympathize 100%. How many mistakes have I made in my life? This is the source of learning, right? This is a very Greek idea. Drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain, says Aeschylus. We learn the hard way, but that's how we learn, and then we can move ahead. But there is this critique that says maybe this existentialist model of history is right, and that this is the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. But this is just a model. It might be right, but it might not be right, or it might be partially right and partially wrong. And the only way to find out is to dig through this stuff and really investigate it. So yeah, we'll move this discussion ahead beyond Oedipus here very shortly. And as Phil always says, hey, Oedipus, he learned some lessons. He made progress. So maybe we can too. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have a question. Has there ever been a time in history like now when the alpha male is being phased out of existence?
Well, since most presidents are still alpha males and most CEOs are still alpha males, it's a little hard to buy the premise.
Well, why don't alpha males rule the world? Like, why is it you got, more of a if you look at world leaders, yeah, Trump is the exception, and I think I know why they put him in there now, because that's like the antivirus. But there was an episode of a season of that show Survivor that proved this experiment that they put the men against the women, and the women figured out pretty early that there's no way they can compete with the men. The men built the shelters, and they had a whole society. And much like a football team, they had the special teams, and those men were the betas were happy to follow the men, and the women were huddled under a rock. And they were like, "Oh my God, we're never going to be able to compete with these guys." So what they did is they sowed dissent, and they got a hold of the betas, and they said, and through a little light flirtation, and they said, "Come, join our side, and we'll take on the alphas." And then, so that's what they did. The betas and the women joined forces, and then when they got rid of the alphas, the women got rid of the betas. And there's this thing, toxic masculinity, and all of this is. And it's, I was wondering if there's any time, like because you're very knowledgeable about the history of mankind. I'm very impressed. This is a very good Zoom call. I've learned a lot. I like what you're saying. So I'm asking, is there, what is because history repeats itself and trends come and go. How do you see with all of this diversity and all of this kind of stuff, and just the way the language, it's not a husband, it's a partner, and this kind of thing, and all this talk? Do you where are we going? What do you think is the logical projection of what this is? I think you're kind of grasping what I'm asking, sure, what I'm saying. So thank
sure.
you for letting me ask my question.
Thank you, Doug. So I don't think we know. The problem with the last 300,000 years of mankind is that hardly any of it ever got written down. So there's an enormous number of things that have happened that we're never going to know that they happened. How many different kinds of cultures are there? Are there cultures, that have done what we're doing today in some form? When it comes to gender relationships, we don't know. We don't know. We have fragments, and the problem is a lot of the fragments that we have are through the eyes of people who are members of other cultures. And so we're not seeing what those cultures were, we're seeing somebody's caricature of it. And that makes it even harder to figure out what might have actually happened. So when it comes to the kinds of questions you're asking, I find a lot of value in acknowledging the limits of my understanding. To say I have a lot of knowledge, only in certain specific areas. If we dig into Chinese history, I have huge gaps, things I don't know. We dig into the history of India. India and China have histories as old as most of the written stuff in Europe, and yet I'm basically clueless because I've done outlines, I've read fragments, I've read a few philosophers, but it doesn't even come close to my understanding of European history. And I would need people from those cultures to come represent, to give us a picture. I know that in China there's been an enormous amount of diversity over time, and that there have been both matriarchal and patriarchal subcultures inside of China, and some of that was written down. And if we had a China expert on here, they might be able to answer your question with those examples and say, well, here's what happened in Tibet during this century, or here's what happened along the Yellow River in this century that was sort of like what you're seeing. But unfortunately, I'm not qualified to talk about that. I find it's a weird comfort for me to go through life and be perfectly willing to say most of this stuff I really don't understand. I'd love to, but unfortunately, I'm aging. I'm only going to get so many decades, and long before I get to the bottom of most of these questions, it'll be my time, and I'll be gone. So I hope that other people will dig into these things and give us a better sense of what the range of possibilities are for relationships between the genders. Because, man, I don't know. But it's kind of what the exercise of this book is about, right? Because what Kenneth is trying to do is to get us so that we see the possibilities for our species as being greater than just what we see around us today. That what we see around us today, we take it for normal and we think that it's normative, that this is the natural only way that things can be. And Kenneth's saying, the study of history and philosophy make it crystal clear that that's not the case. People have lived in wildly different ways than the way we live right now. And the only way to find out about that stuff is to dig into it and study. So that's the main advice I can give is, go search, go dig, go investigate and see where we can find real examples of people having lived in different ways and did it work or not? What were their pros and cons? It's kind of
Why did we cut off Donald? I wanted to hear from Donald. He was in line and he was cut off.
I'm calling on him in a second. Doug thought I was calling on him. But that's okay. We'll shift the line, right? So thank you, Doug, for your questions. And I could say, if there's one golden rule in philosophy more than any, it's dig, dig, dig. As Kenneth Smith says, seekers after gold have to turn up a lot of dirt. You got to learn a lot about a lot of things, and that's in those investigations are what's going to help us shake up our preconceptions and look at the world in new ways. Donald, you're off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm always thankful to Geneva. We started this discussion years ago with we're either existentialist or escapist. And Geneva always reminds us that it's our constant bumping into the world and to each other within the world that prevents us from being escapist, that leads us to be existentialist, that we, one we've discussed many times, we must first know that to know thyself, we must first know thyself is the basis for sophrosune. There's no sophrosune without self-knowledge. And there's probably there is self-knowledge without bumping into the world, but it's probably specious. It's probably doesn't deserve the name knowledge. And so I was thinking, we talked last week particularly, that we sort of get beyond certain things that we kind of look down on. The griff, the lowest sort of Hegelian form of knowledge, or gnosis, the lowest form of Greek type knowledge, or that preoccupation with our being an idiot. But at the same time, this infatuation, this gnosic clinging to the world, and this idiotic clinging to what's ours, if brought forward, like through some organic development process, like the bud, the flower, and the fruit, saves us from the escapism, because it's at this lowest level of being an idiot, being a slave to our passions, our ties to the world, and stuff like that, that that keep us from being escapist and allow us to go on and be existentialist. So anyway, that's my peon to Geneva. In that, but I think it's generally true. We see this dialectic and we overcome these earlier stages of development, but it must be an overcoming. It can't be a leaving behind, because the leaving behind is the escape. It's the because without this bumping into the world, we produce those speculative, rational, I don't know what is Stephen calls them, rationalism, real, or whatever, which are just, they're like mathematics. As much as I love mathematics, mathematics largely has no subject. If you just admire its abstract beauty, that's fine, but it doesn't tell you much about any objects in the world. Okay, enough, and just thank you again, Geneva.
Thank you, Donald. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, really just actually.
I think your audio is breaking up, Joe. You might have an unstable internet connection where you're at. Okay, we'll have to come back to you later, Joe. Sorry. Let's see, where are we on our time schedule? Geneva, Phil, 12:38. Yeah, not quite time for you, Phil, but soon. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on Stephen and then Sharon and then come to you, Phil, and because I'm working on the clock. We'll give Joe a little bit of time to fix his connection. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was thinking about the movie Independence Day. You must have gone along to see that, Rick. Did you ever pick up on the irony? I forget who was the guy who was playing the president when the alien tried to possess his mind, and the president saw into all their plans. He said, I can see what they're trying to do. They go from world to world, exploiting the resources and eating out the planet for all it's worth. And I was thinking one of his guards could have said, you mean they're like us, Mr. President?
Exactly.
And I'm sorry to say, but all of us aren't really big on the mover scale. We're not up there. We're not presidents. We're not CEOs of companies. We are, unfortunately, what Nietzsche would say is the servile class. And we sit around and we complain about the movers, which is exactly what the servile class in ancient Rome would have been doing all the time. It's a very passive position. But who are you going to be if you ever felt some power coursing through you? It's very easy to be a member of the servile class, which is what I've been all my life. And I spent a good chunk of my life complaining about the bosses. But what am I going to be like when I'm a boss? What am I going to be like when I've got some power? I think really, this is what I mean. I look at all, you join all these groups. Now we've got Zoom groups. You've got a real smorgasbord now. You can join whole groups of the servile class. They're all over the place. I mean, people have probably, got some command on their plate, probably are seldom going to have time for Zoom groups. So I'm hearing them all the time, and they're always saying the same things. Oh, if I was boss, I would do something different. I don't know, when it comes to, sort of the racial complaints, like complaining about the Jews, it's come back after 50 years. And I think, yeah, look at the other side. Well, not just race, any sort of group. Oh, they're the bad guys. I'm the good guy. Really? I'm afraid, you look at the human animal, and they have amazingly well, almost the same set of potentials. And it doesn't matter where you go, you're going to find practically the same set of behaviours. And the same set of behaviours must be in me. I have to be Oedipus Tyrannus. He's buried within me. There's that potential. And I think my biggest lesson is beware of shooting the messenger. If you're going to do bad things, go and do bad things, but don't create a false philosophy. If you're doing bad things, just admit that you're the bad guy, whatever it is. Sort of be honest with yourself. People make excuses. They engage in apologetics for their bad action. I'd rather them just going being bad and admitting they're bad for once in their life, and just saying, well, it'd be nice if things were different. That's just the way they are. But it's just weird. It's always the same thing. People are always playing this game. I'm the good guy. I deserve all the goodies. I deserve all the sweets. That other guy who wants the sweets, he's the bad guy. Yeah, really. Yeah, I'm 65 now, and I've seen this game being played all my life, and I'm a bit tired of it by now, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I left the Department of Veterans Affairs over my frustration with the way that they were managing the software. And I started my own nonprofits to manage the software better. And what I discovered was, in most cases, I was able not to make the same mistakes that the VA made. But being in charge meant that I made mistakes that were typical of me and my character. And they weren't necessarily small mistakes, right? I mean, I didn't have the budget the VA did, so that I couldn't have the reach of disaster that the VA did when they were mismanaging their software. But on the scale that I was at, it was clear enough, the mistakes that I was causing because of my character, that I could look at it and say, if I did have the VA's budget, then instead of being annoying problems to a small number of people, these would be gigantic national level problems. Just a different set of, I would have swapped out a different set of flaws, but still made mistakes at the same scale. And this is in line with what you're talking about. Is philosophy? If we're using the tools of philosophy to criticize other people and make ourselves feel good about ourselves for playing that zero-sum winners-losers game, like you're saying, then it's not philosophy at all. It's sophistry. It's just rhetoric. And it doesn't become philosophy, says Kafka and Kenneth Smith, until we apply those tools against ourselves and say, what is the terrible freight that we are carrying into each situation? And if we are lucky enough never to hold a lot of power, then that terrible freight will never find a vehicle to express itself on a large scale. But if we do find ourselves in a position of power, then those problems will manifest on a large scale. The things that we think are no big deal, we think they're intrinsically no big deal, but in fact, they're only not a big deal because we don't have any power yet. If we had power, they would become a big deal, and that'd be a problem for everyone. Now, this is the neutral part. Now I have to share the really shameful part, which is in at least one case, the mistake that I swore I would never, one of the mistakes I swore I would never make, said this is the whole reason I'm leaving so that I will never make that mistake, is exactly one of the main mistakes that I'm making in my current nonprofit. It's like we hope to move on to new mistakes, right? We hope that there's growth and progress and that we aren't just circling around and around. And in some cases, that's true with my career. But in at least one really annoying case, I'm literally repeating the exact same mistake as my previous nonprofit. It drives me up the wall. So humility, it's a powerful tool for understanding where we go wrong and how to grow. I'm 100% with you, Stephen. Scapegoating.
It's amazing. I'm not a Christian in the normal sense of the word, but a lot of this stuff is in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Precisely in the New Testament.
Yeah, exactly.
And strangely, people have missed the message even today. I mean, I think that was one of the first things I learned in philosophy. Well, yeah, very early on, the revelation, philosophers will say the faults we find in other people are usually the ones that are so greatly manifest in ourselves. The things that annoy you about in other people, look to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just to finish what Donald said, I think it is in the New Testament, and Jesus said, take the mote out of your own eye first before you go after somebody else's. But anyway, what I really want to do is follow up on what Geneva said and what Donald said, because I think we're talking about this 2 weeks in succession, and I have a perspective, and I do hate to use that word, which I think allows you to grow. One of my favorite books is The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. And the first sentence in that book is, life is difficult. And that is, he said that's one of the greatest truths. And if you ever even superficially read Buddhism, one of the 4 greatest truths is that life is suffering. And we as human beings, as we try to develop our character, have to face that truth. And I was reading a bit of Kierkegaard, and we look at truth either subjectively or objectively. And you talked about perspectivism just earlier in this call. Well, if you use perspectivism, which I think is when you look at truth subjectively, then you're going to run into chaos. But looking at truth objectively doesn't just involve you, it involves your village for you to get the right points to develop. So life is difficult, and it's a series of problems, and we just have to keep trying and solving them. And the day we don't do that anymore because we can't, then we're dead. And that's just the way it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, Phil, your time's come around. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, what's on my mind is I'm going to try to answer the alpha male question. Like the deep structure of the male species, not the female species, because the females were at home taking care of the family and nurturing the children as they grow. The deep part of the male perspective, which goes to all male species of animals, is to spread their seeds, because the selfish gene wanted to prolong its own existence. So the lion, when it begins to rule the prey, kills off all the other small lions that were spawned by some other thing. Okay? And what happened in a sense of this, and the prey is still controlled to a certain degree by by the female lions. You know, to a certain degree, is that in a sense, it was the question of marriage, which is a cultural aspect that transformed the relationship between a matriarchal society to a patriarchal society. It's a cultural product. What a marriage did was, in a sense, to give control to the male because they now rule the pride in some sense, and in a sense, the last name of alpha males, of all males, is that it was in the male's domination. That is a cultural product that come out of the, in the sense of marriage. Marriage made it legal for the man to take over from the women, and the women has, in a sense, trying to slowly reclaim at least part of the power in that sense to get back that situation. It is a cultural product, not a natural product like the acorn is bound to become what an oak. The cultural product is what produces that. And you have to address the alpha male, such as Donald Trump, the bull in the china shop, in a sense, bringing us to the state of war. In a sense, that cultural product, in a sense, rules the world. That is the alpha male. Not because he's interested in bringing war, but because he can no longer, in a sense, have the freedom to spread his seed, to create his progeny, to, in a sense, ensure his selfish gene to exist. So that cultural product, please do not put it in the fact of nature, but in fact, it is a cultural product. And we need to obey the culture and understand that it is a shift, a paradigm shift in the culture that produces this thing rather than nature. Okay? That's what I want to address in a sense. Don't be confused by the fact that the alpha male is a natural product, but a cultural product that stole the domination of the culture from the matriarchy to a patriarchy. And when you address that, then you have to solve the problem in the culture, not through nature, because that's not what the nature is. There's many, many stories about a man tending to his garden. What is that about? That's a metaphor for, in a sense, taking care of your woman to make sure that she spreads your seed. Okay? That's it, Phil. That is the address to the alpha male. That is a natural situation that produced out of culture. That's it, Phil.
I like that, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I'm gonna say we stick a pin in the gender relations question, because we could spend more than 3 hours just digging into the possibilities. The Greek, to bring us closer back to the text, the Greek take on this would be that other animal species tend to have locked in a specific set of gender relationships, like in the seahorse. The female lays her eggs in the male's brood pouch, and then the male cares for the eggs and raises them to hatch and become little seahorses. And that's very different from what we think of as the typical typical male role in the human species. It's certainly different from what we see in lions. With the more we study biology, the more we discover an enormous variation of possibilities. But what's interesting about all the species except ours, from the Greek perspective, is that most biological species have a single cultural species that goes with them. That is to say, there is some set of possibilities that for that one biological species, it's going to have a certain set of relationships that it's that it's healthy for it to live that way. And from one animal species to another, it can be very different. Like the bonobos and chimpanzees, which superficially resemble each other, have wildly different gender relationships. But they don't mix and match. Their gender relationships tend to stay put within a species. The exception to this rule from the Greek perspective is Homo sapiens. We aren't as hardwired as most species are. There was a big fad in the early 2000s to try to explain everything that we do as being driven by evolution. But evolution itself doesn't support that. What we see in Homo sapiens is there's an interesting phenomena that happens in evolution sometimes where instead of adding complexity, a species will, using a discredited 19th century term, devolve into a simpler form. There are some phyla of animals that people used to think, when I was first learning biology in the 70s and 80s, people used to think that these were primitive forms of animals because look how simple they are. But in some cases, we've discovered that they're not primitive at all. They're highly derived. They derived from more complicated species. And in the process of evolution, they purged some of their characteristics and became a simpler species. There's some parasitical forms, for example, that's true of. So to express this Greek perspective on Homo sapiens and an evolutionary perspective, the argument would be that our distant pre-human ancestors were probably more locked into having a single cultural species. And you could say meaningfully about those species, okay, these are the relationships between men and women, and it's just like this, and it's not anything else. But with Homo sapiens, at least, that part of us has devolved, and we are not as bound to a single culture as other species are. And so if you travel around the world and look at different cultures, you're going to find each of them becomes a particular cultural species. But one cultural species of Homo sapiens may be very, very different from another cultural species of Homo sapiens. And that means it's very hard to generalize about us. It's very hard to arrive at any conclusions and say, this is how all people are supposed to be, without somebody else coming along and saying, but let me show you these 42 exceptions. We are the animal that, as an animal, has an enormous amount of variability culturally. And in terms of answering questions like the ones Doug raised, it makes it very, very hard for us. It's much easier to say what the gender relationships are among lions or wolves or cheetahs than it is to say what they are in Homo sapiens. But other than that, I'm going to put it on a shelf for this week so we can work our way back to the text. Because, of course, we want to finish up with paragraph 10 here and get into paragraph 11. It's not all Oedipus he's talking about here. He's got other stuff to tell us about. So A.W. Crow, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I missed the text, but I get the gist of the conversation. Thanks. Sounds great, actually. It's my first meeting here. But talking about complaining, going back about leaders and different groups, and it takes a. I remember when I was made a manager 25 years ago. I hated the job. It wasn't me. I don't like people telling me what to do, and I don't like being told what to do. That sums it up. So I've been a consultant for 25 years. But, being put in that position, we all know you need a certain mindset. I mean, we push those people to the top, right? That have those traits. Usually psychopathic, narcissistic, unfortunately. Hey, it's the way it is, right? I mean, it's that's what it takes. And given those decisions that need to be made in those leadership positions, that fair, not fair. I mean, the only thing you want out of those leaders is that their intent is not selfish. That's the best you can hope for. That they're making decisions for the group, and I mean, you can bitch and moan about it, but that's the only thing you can hope for in that situation. And the quote from the movie was fascinating because that's the, we talk about us being explorers, and the truth of history is we don't explore to out of curiosity. We never have as a species. We only explore to exploit resources. That's the only reason. If we had enough where we were right now, we would never need to go and exploit resources elsewhere. Right? And that's the same for every species. They'll consume everything in their territory without until it's gone, and then populations decline or they go extinct if they've used it all. And we're just another animal that works that same way, right? So this idea that we explore for different reasons. The only thing that changed that is after World War II, they made it illegal in the World Court to go acquire land from another country. Before that, you could go and you could attack a country, take land, and if you won the war, you got the land. But after World War II, they made that change. So it's made a huge difference. And you know, I think if we look at you know, smaller and smaller concentric circles of influence. If someone's a leader of the world, leader of continent, country, what are they like? But then bring that right down to your family, your immediate friends. How do you treat them? Are you that nasty leader? Are you making selfish decisions within that space as well? I don't know. I try not to. I try not to. But I think you can find those leadership qualities all the way down to that level. But you don't have as much control of as many resources. But you may be still trying to control people within that smaller group, right? And I know the evolution discussion there about looking at everything through the lens of evolution, right? What was it? But I think what you need to realize is for animals, their evolution is pressure from the environment. Whereas what's included, you know, in some of the higher order animals like elephants and other that exist in groups, they do have behavioral evolutionary traits, but the challenge we have is culture. As much as physical traits are evolutionary, things that we could think of as behavioral, cultural, institutions, that's all evolution, right? And I mean, I would argue that our natural environment is hunter-gatherer. All these artificially created institutions like politics, religion, social orders, I mean, marriage and that, they're all made for trying to organize larger and larger groups of people. Poorly, I would say. Poorly. I mean, you know, I know that when I think about in large groups, if I was required to make some of the decisions, I certainly couldn't do it. You know, you have imperfect information, and you're trying to make decisions. I mean, that's the only thing you can emphasize with these guys. I think it's the knowing. You need to know to be able to say, oh, I don't have enough information. I can't make the decision now, but the pressures to make these decisions, I don't know. How much of the problems that we have going on in politics and within our culture today are manufactured in order to move the group in a certain way versus real. And then they'll still take that and try and move the group in a certain way. Anyway,
Thank
That's
you.
enough for me.
I
Thanks.
appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your perspective. Yeah, it's a, some of what you're talking about is a very Greek take. This idea that, other animals have sophrosune. The sophrosune of a cheetah is different from the sophrosune of a lion, but it has this drive to be interested in the things that are good for it as a species. But as Phil likes to say, the thing about one way to summarize the Greek take on this is that Homo sapiens is different. We're a cultural animal. We're a political animal, and we have these giant gaps in our motivation at a biological level that have to be filled in culturally. We have to imitate and learn what we're supposed to care about and what we're supposed to love. And we're really at the mercy of the culture. If it's a healthy culture, then it's going to imprint on us these kind of healthy enthusiasms. Reindeer hunters who've been reindeer hunting for thousands of years, what they pass on to their kids probably does give them effective reindeer hunting interests and skills. But I haven't done any reindeer hunting, despite I've got a little bit of Finnish in my background. The blood doesn't do me any good. There's nothing in me that naturally makes me a good reindeer hunter because I'm not like other animals. I'm Homo sapiens. And so if I go out and try to prescribe, well, here's how you should do reindeer hunting, I'm going to be full of shit. I got no cultural imprints that that have been tried and tested, evolutionarily, and then passed down to me that I can pass on to anybody else. When it reduces to the level of me trying to think my way through these problems, it's really hit or miss compared to cultures that have had evolutionary pressures driving them to become who they became over time. And so Phil likes to say there's this, with Homo sapiens, you've got nature one and nature two. And nature one is the actual laws of nature around us. And when that speaks, we can be sure it's authoritative. Gravity, you hop off a cliff, I don't care if you just watch Superman, you aren't going to go up in the air like a bird, right? You gotta pay attention to these laws of nature because they're authoritative on us. But in nature two, we're dealing with the artificial nature of the city and the town and the farm and all these constructs that we've created out of our enthusiasms, ostensibly in the hope that they're viable, that they're going to be healthy. But only time will tell if they're dead ends or if they're viable for the long run. A lot of what we think of as modern civilization is so recent. It's just a few thousand years old, or in some cases just a few centuries, or God help us, in some cases just a few decades. How much of the modern world derives from Star Trek? It's like, oh, I want a communicator, I want a tricorder, I want these things that they've got, and we made them, and that's great. But does it work for us? We have no idea. There hasn't been time for
Hey,
evolution.
Rick, even though you're finished, you are not finished.
Exactly. I have a little bit of Finnish by blood, but I am not remotely culturally Finnish, and so I'm incompetent to pass along anything like Finnish culture. I mean, I must not be trusted. so these the questions you're raising, AW, they're relevant here. How we answer them, that's a whole other thing, right? Fred, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to be here. Appreciate the discussion. I think one of the key points that's raised by Kenneth Smith here is peripeteia, or reversal of fortune, where your actions become self-enslaving, and Oedipus is the primary example here. So it's not so much a question of should I pursue dominance over others, should I pursue influence and authority, or should I not? Because even if you pursue influence or leverage, it's going to come back to bite you. So you won't get what you get, and you see that constantly. Where even if you're king of the world, that won't give you what you want because you'll be entrapped by that authority. If nothing else, you will become paranoid. You will never be satisfied with the power that you have. And you'll be estranging people that you care about or should care about. And you'll ultimately, despite all your power, you end up dying an impoverished, unsatisfied, pathetic human being. And he interestingly, he turns it over to Kierkegaard here, where he talks about the juxtaposition of the pagan or aesthetic life versus the ethical and spiritual life. And that he just barely alludes to it, but you could carry it a lot further than he does here. And I think there's merit in that. For me, I'm not an alpha male. I'm not even a beta male. I would say I'm a gamma male in that I'm just out of the game entirely. I could care less about power and influence. And if somebody was foolish enough to drop authority and power in my lap, I would drop it like a hot potato. I don't want anything to do with it because I know that I would not employ it well, and it would destroy me even if I were able to hold on to it. So the ultimate lesson here is I think the peripeteia and the fate of the individual, the reversals of the individual play out writ large in society and vice versa. And so we're products of our society, and society is products of ourselves corporately. And it's wise of Kenneth Smith to constantly press the point that you won't get what you expect when you try to be grasping, and therefore consider at least the aesthetic life of Kierkegaard. And you could say, as a footnote, which I won't pursue, confer Hegel's bondsman master dialectic if you want to know about how you become enslaved by your own authority. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks for taking us back to the text. It's right on. And yeah, Kenneth loves these things. The reference to Kierkegaard, you're right. He could have taken this essay in an entirely different direction by digging deeply into Kierkegaard, and it would have illuminated the points he's made up to that point in a new and more interesting way. And part of the reason he references Kierkegaard in here is this is Kenneth's style. Is it's there to motivate us to read beyond the article, right? It's Kenneth's style of writing is constantly pointing out at other writers, and the reason he does that is not to say, look how smart I am, I've read all these guys, but it's to say, go read Kierkegaard. You're gonna really get a lot out of it. It's gonna enrich this discussion. Kenneth used to teach classes on Kierkegaard, and I'm still trying to arrange to get myself. You can get some of them as recordings. I'm still trying to arrange to pick up some of his Kierkegaard in recordings because I want to dig more into this. But what you're talking about the aesthetic personality is very much on point here.
There's a guy named from Chicago, host Eric Christensen, has been doing meetings on Kierkegaard for over 10 years. He's like really into Kierkegaard and Kant. Eric Christensen from Chicago. He's the head of Meetup, the Chicago Meetup.
Thank you, Ginny. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's resources available. And Kierkegaard he takes some deep reading, partly because he's so ironic. He writes so many of his essays not saying here's what I think, but by pitting different characters against each other, and he hopes that you'll notice what kind of people these are who are having this argument, so you won't just take everything they say literally as the truth. He's trying to represent different perspectives in an argument with each other. And it's like watching Star Trek. It's not that you're supposed to agree with Spock or Dr. McCoy or Kirk, but you're supposed to watch the interactions and start to learn something about how different perspectives influence the way we see the world. And of course, that's the subject of this book, isn't it? So I'm going to take us through the end of paragraph 10 and get into that paragraph 11 that Fred was taking us to, because there's some good stuff coming. So he wraps up by saying Oedipus is primally mistaken which of his powers or virtues ought to be harnessed to the others. He stands as an exemplary human pathogen, the very paragon of what the sophists professed and fostered as fulfilled rationality and individuality, what Aristophanes savaged in the combat between the old and the new logoi and the birds. one of Kenneth Smith's philosophy professors back when he was a student did a translation of Aristophanes' The Birds. William Arrowsmith, I think is this. So I read little references like this as not only saying, hey, you should go read Aristophanes' The Birds, but also, hey, check out William Arrowsmith's translation of The Birds. And this is that subtext that you sort of Kenneth has a prejudice against footnotes. He doesn't like to, he says, litter up the page with a whole bunch of footnotes because he's trying to write for a more popular audience than an academic audience. So you kind of have to mentally insert the footnotes on your own in order to get the full effect of kind of what he's bringing to it. So okay, so Kenneth has had his fun going after Oedipus and trying to show us, what we can learn from the character. In paragraph 11, he starts to take us more directly at the topics that David put in the summary for this week's session. So he kicks off with sin etymologically derives from a root signifying a splitting off. It is akin, and he does mean etymologically, to asunder, scintilla, scissors, shingle, and even science as a methodologically analytical procedure. Sin is the rending of what ought to be whole. So he's talking here about, he's alluding to this Hegelian idea that the two different fundamental faculties of the mind, of the basal metabolism of the mind, gnosis and noesis. Gnosis, the immersive faculty that puts us into the feelings and the experiences and the memories, that is a whole forming. WHOL, curse English for making whole and whole be sound exactly the same, but WHOL, whole forming, it is the way in which people plug themselves into the larger world, is through the sensations. And you can really see this with a meal. I mean, a mediocre meal doesn't do much for you, and you can do whatever you want while you're eating it. But when you eat an amazing meal, you get that first bite in your mouth, and you might have been in the middle of a conversation. You take a bite, and then that's it. The conversation just went off the rails, because now it's like, oh my God, what is in my mouth? Oh, this aroma. Oh, this flavor, this texture. This is amazing. And you might have to talk about it with the person that you're with and go, who made this? This is great. There is a way in which gnosis can rip our attention away from the world of abstracta that we're dealing with in order to plug us back into the larger whole. And you see this when you follow, if you closely follow the life of any animal. I've lived with cats my whole life, and I've had times when I lived on a farm and got to know goats and ducks and chickens and others. And if you follow them around, you can see the extent to which they really are plugging themselves into the larger world. Their senses they make their mind alive to what's happening around them. It's not just about losing yourself. It's about being alive. That term that Nora Bateson uses, symathesy, which she defines as the critically important definition of life, that we are in a perpetual learning relationship with our environment, so that we sense things and we reflect on how that's different from what we expected, and we change our understanding and we change our behavior and we act in a new way, and it changes our environment, and then we sense new things as a result of that. That feedback loop is that loop in which we can be iteratively, incrementally improving, like Geneva talks about. We can be, as long as we're paying attention to reality, and this is gnosis's great power, is that it will pull us, it will seduce us into reality. Noesis is the opposite of a whole forming synthetic faculty. It's a dissecting analytical faculty. It's how we learn the steps of things, not the whole thing, but here are the steps we have to do. When we learn anatomy and we learn all the terminology for all the pieces of anatomy, that's noetic knowledge. Bits and pieces cutting, as the surgeon looks at your body and doesn't see you, but just sees a bunch of dotted lines, where do I cut in order to extract this or access that? This is that analytical power, in a nutshell. And we use it to learn, we use it to fit ourselves into abstract systems where our sense of taste isn't going to do us much good, our sense of smell isn't going to do us much good, where we have to just memorize the steps and get them in order and break things up. This is what he's alluding to in this sentence when he talks about science being methodologically analytical. He's saying you select some part of the whole of the world and you treat it separately from the rest of the world, and you try to model just that piece, and you collect data that you can use to try to represent that event that's happening. And then you try to build a model that can account for why that data is the way it is and why the thing changes over time. This is an analytical cutting activity. So this is what he's alluding to here. And he's saying that sin, the word sin, is related to these terms. And for the very first time I read this, and he'd said this before about sin and science. It was in an earlier essay of his. I think it was in Dramas of the Mind. And at first I was really reluctant to take it in. I didn't really want to believe it. But the more you look at the way that it's conducted in the modern world, especially where science is not allowed to pursue whatever the most important questions are, it's only allowed to pursue what you can get funding for. And so it becomes attached to the market, and it becomes a mechanism by which corporate dominance is achieved. You can see how it's tied up into these larger systemic issues. One wonders what science would be like in a different society that didn't tether it that way to immediate return on investment, and can you increase this quarter's profits? So when he talks about sin as being the rending of what ought to be whole, part of what he's talking about is the fact that other species have the sophrosyne that drives their experiential life, their gnosis, to be obsessed with the things that will plug them into the aspects of the world that they belong in, that evolution has worked out that they can succeed here, and that they care about those things, and they notice those things, and they want those things. That is hitting the mark, which is associated with sophrosyne, is associated with making the animal be part of the larger whole. Not merely a part, it's also an individual, but it finds its harmony with the larger whole. Sin then is related to this problem that Homo sapiens doesn't have sophrosyne. We try to substitute enthusiasm for sophrosyne, but the things that we're enthusiastic about may be the wrong targets, and we may be pursuing, hitting the mark, but it's the wrong mark, so we're missing the right mark. And in that way, we fail to weave ourselves in a healthy way into the larger whole of nature. We attach ourselves to something that makes us sick, right? Like putting fracking waste into an aquifer. That should be a source of clean water for, tens of thousands of years to come. But instead, it will never be clean water again for anybody. If water is life, then that kind of pollution is death. And we're spreading that all over the continents. This is not what a healthy species does. This has nothing to do with being a socialist or a pinko or green or non-violent. It has nothing to do with any of those things. It has to do with the basics of survival. Non-idealistic nuts and bolts survival comes down to what are the things this animal needs to survive, and how do we protect those things and nurture those things to make sure there's plenty of it to go around. I mean, you don't do it by destroying aquifers. But we have structured society in such a way that we've created these perverse incentives, and people have to go through enormous amounts of education in this society to learn how to wreck their own ecosystem and reduce their capacity to survive. This is a missing of the mark. It's a sin, and it splits us off. It rends the relationship between us and the larger kind of life-giving system that we stand upon. This is an example of what he means when he talks about the rending of what ought to be whole. He's also talking here about something that, and this is a really dense pair of sentences. That's why I pulled it out, and I'm kind of picking at it here to make sure that you see all the stuff that Kenneth is bringing to it. He's also talking here about the idea from Hegel, when Hegel says to abstract is to be in error. To abstract is to be in error. That's Hegel. And Hegel's talking about noesis. He's talking about that analytical faculty we have. He's saying, on the one hand, noesis separates us from the animals because we're able to to organize our lives such that noesis leads our lives instead of being a mere servant. Right? Cats could do analysis, but they do analysis in the service of their gnosis. Right? They're strategizing for how to catch the mouse. But we can invert that relationship, and we often do in the modern world, where the noesis is the leader. You have to go to school. You have to learn all of these systematizing things. You have to learn these systematizing roles in society, and you do all this stuff through this process of noesis. And that process of noesis connects us to what Phil calls nature two. We're now connected to this artificial world that we've constructed for our relationships with each other. But it disconnects us from nature one, because the things that we do in order to fit in to nature two often destroy our relationship with nature one. And they also destroy our ability to detect that destruction. They destroy our ability to detect the rending of what ought to be whole, because we learn not to value the things that are necessary for our survival. And we learn instead to value the things for which we're rewarded artificially within our artificial societies. And all of this is just extrapolation of what the Greeks are talking about with Oedipus and with these other topics that are coming up in this chapter, that we are prone to missing the mark so profoundly that you can build entire civilizations in which everyone misses the mark together and therefore conclude that they're all hitting the mark, because after all, we're doing what everybody else is doing. And surely that's right. I have Phil down next for, oh, yes, now. Excellent. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
What's in my mind is something that I find interesting in this sense. I recently have an understanding of the concept of nous in the Greeks. I think nous is, from what I think of, is different from arche, because arche is coming to you and you're sensing it. But nous is some kind of intelligence that could, in a sense, surpass that. And I myself think, and I could be wrong, that it is somehow tied to some kind of intuition. It's not a transcendental thing or transcendent thing, but it's an intuition that, in a sense, that you somehow understand where the line is, in some sense, and imagination is also an important part of it. And I think you have to trust that at some point you have a kind of intuitive intelligence to penetrate beneath all of this rational stuff, as well as this sort of just existential stuff, to, in a sense, tie it together. And I think that's an important part. And you might wonder, well, what is nous? Is it just a mathematical intelligence? Or is it just a kind of existential intelligence? No, it's something that ties it together. And I think that's an important part, because I think you have this sort of feeling that somehow intuition, that you have to somehow refine that. But quite often, at least when I do art, I really trust my intuition in making the first sketch. But then I have to go through the sketch and refine it and refine it and refine it. But into the first sketch is the idea. The idea by itself does not work, but you have to manifest it, work it over, and in a sense, apply this sort of I guess, rational intelligence in relationship to that. But the first day is you have this feeling that somehow it's got you. Your intuition say, somehow it's in there somewhere. And I think that's a very, very important part of what nous is, because you can lasso it in and bring it to fruition. And I think the Greeks were very, very interested in the importance of nous, because the nous is what ties it together in some sense, but in some sense you have to work at it as well, going back and forth, and actually getting some opinions of other people too, because otherwise it's just sort of it just seems like just seeing the world as it is and hearing the mathematical equations, that's not enough. It's got to come from some intuition that needs to be worked over. Okay, that's what I think nous is, but I could be wrong about what the Greeks think nous is.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, you're probably right. I don't have a strong take on the word nous yet. That's why I still have to study ancient Greek. I know it's incredibly important. Aristotle talks about it all the time. But I have not yet been able to figure out how he relates it to gnosis, noesis, sophron, phronesis, these other terms. I'm still slowly trying to work out the relationships between them to the Greeks. And what's probably complicating it is, I mean, there's like 100 years between some of these writers. These terms may well have drifted from where they were from Heraclitus's or Thales' time to say Aristotle's time. So, but yeah, Noos is on my to-do list to try to scratch deeper than Wikipedia and try to figure out exactly how do they relate it to these other terms. So thanks for bringing it up. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, sorry. It's been, I don't know, kind of hard to connect. But in any case, I appreciate it. I think that this has actually really been a very good discussion. One of the things that I think is really important to highlight is the idea of these limits that we have. And specifically, I'll come back to the agency and contingency, point that where Kenneth talks a little bit earlier in the text about how do you, basically overcoming our delusions and illusions. And then you have to ask yourself, how do you even do that? And you need a certain degree of agency. And you're able to do that, and you're able to master yourself to some degree and be able to navigate the world. But the problem that then exists is that it's a model. It's a model of the world that you have. And what happens is that you start to mistaken, often people will mistaken the model that they are a system within the system, so that their model is reality. And so that there's a social system that they then think they have all the answers to. And somehow that creates the inability to see the limits of your ability to know. And that becomes problematic because then you start to obviously think you can, you have all the answers. And so I think that's one aspect of it, is just thinking about it in terms of, in the terms of agency, and how you need agency to manage your desires or your illusions and delusions, but that same agency that enables you to manage those desires or those illusions and delusions, we start to think our models are the right models. The second part is, really quickly, I would just like to say is that, and I'll be quick with this, is that it's about managing desire. I think that that's a really important part of this entire conversation. Sometimes we can fool ourselves and even be doing something that's, the right thing, so to speak. Seems like the right thing, seems like even a good thing, and it is a good thing. And then you start to think that you're doing a good thing, and then all of a sudden you realize, people realize that they're satisfying their own desires. And that's really no different than what somebody else is doing. So the fact that you don't look back at yourself and you start to think you're doing a good thing and the other person's doing a wrong thing, And the reality is that you're satisfying your desire, because it doesn't really matter what you're doing. It's maybe the fact that you're not doing something for the act itself. And that comes back to the whole point of managing your character, which is everything, this whole, I mean, all these sessions to some degree touch on that. There's just one other thing I'll just bring up really quickly too, is that also the way we look at data and information in our models of the world, we kind of find, forget that these are models that don't represent reality. And then we take this data as gospel, and it's just a representation of something that doesn't necessarily align to reality. So basically, it has a way of kind of confirming our biases. So again, that comes back to, well, I even have data to prove that I'm doing the right thing, or I have all the answers. And you forget that, no, you don't. You really don't. And but that comes back to, again, the whole idea is knowing that your model is not the only model that exists in the world. So anyway, I thought that this is actually kind of builds up to the whole idea of Oedipus as well. And even what we're discussing now is having, these, the loops that we're using to understand ourselves, how perverted they actually are.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, a very Greek summation. It's the challenge for us, right? Is that the more we rely on our intellect and education, the more we start to assume that our intellect and education are giving us an accurate picture of the world, because it's able to give us what seems like a consistent picture of the world. But what we're not seeing by definition is two things. One is we're not seeing the lacunae. We're not seeing all the things our unconscious chose not to bring to our attention. And so to us, the world as we have put it together in our heads looks to us like it doesn't have any gaps. But if an outside objective observer, if such a thing could exist, were to map what's in our head to what's in reality, enormous gaps would open up that we're not conscious of. And our lack of consciousness of those gaps is part of what convinces us that we must be right. Because after all, we're sure that if we were wrong, we would see gaps. The idea that our mind has the capacity to erase gaps is something that just never occurs to most people. And as a result, they don't question themselves very clearly. That's on the negative side, what's missing from the picture. On the positive side, in line with what you're saying, is this issue that, yeah, we may have evidence, but that's no guarantee that we haven't cherry-picked the evidence. I mean, the cosmos offers us an infinite amount of evidence. And we're not, when we make our argument, we don't deploy all the evidence the cosmos has to offer. We'll never be exposed to most of it. I mean, we don't even get off the planet. So let alone, we don't get to most parts on the planet, let alone get off of it. So we're offering a teeny tiny cherry-picked selection of evidence. But because it satisfies our appetites or our ideologies, we feel that it's enough. We are persuaded. And therefore, we generalize from ourselves being persuaded to saying it is inherently persuasive. This evidence that I'm giving you is therefore the proof that what I'm saying is right. And therefore, it is all the evidence. If there's any further evidence out there, it will ipso facto be exactly the same as the evidence that I'm providing. We turn our little cherry-picked piece of evidence into a synecdoche that the small part that stands for the whole. And in doing so, we're begging the question. We think we've answered the question. All we're doing is begging it, saying, yeah, of course, the critic would say, of course, we've got some evidence that what we're saying is true. There's a lot of evidence out there. Some goes both ways. But notice that in our collection, we've chosen the stuff that validates and reinforces our position. We should have also chosen a bunch of the stuff that criticizes our position and makes us question our model. If we treated it as a model, then we would have done that. That would have been the more mature adult thing to do, to say our model is just a model, allow us to find its strengths and weaknesses. But no, we turned it into an ideology by excluding all the contradictory evidence and only including evidence that seems to prove that we're right. It's all these things you're talking about are right on, Joe, and they go right to the heart of the epistemological question that the Greeks were so concerned about, and that moderns just blithely blunder past. You know, for us, I was having a conversation with my folks on Sunday morning. I go for these walks around Green Lake, and we talk philosophy and politics the whole time. And I was talking about this very problem, you know, that Hannah Arendt writes about in one of the 2 extra chapters she added in the 1967 edition of Between Past and Future, her essay Truth and Politics, where she says that she sees over and over in the modern world, one of the biggest problems that we have is that people confuse the different kinds of truth with each other. And the different kinds of truth are radically different. The kind of truth that comes from a bunch of people getting together and deciding something, this is political truth. It's a political process. And you could get everybody in the world to agree with you, but it doesn't make it real. But we live in, as Phil says, we live in nature too. We live immersed in these artificial realms in which getting everybody on earth to agree does seem to mean something. That's how you get things done in the marketplace and in our politics. But we forget that nature too is not authoritative over nature one. The human world doesn't get to redefine the laws of gravity just because 8 billion people all decided they wanted to fly. You know, it's you know, you can flap your arms as hard as you want. You still don't go to the moon. Not even if 8 billion people all agree that you do. You're still standing there on the ground. And Hannah Arendt says this is the difference between empirical, real truth, natural truth, which is not impressed with our arguments. Even if every single person votes against it, it remains true. versus political truth, where it matters if you can persuade other people. And we're sort of tortured on this rack. We're racked between these opposing forces, in which they have different kinds of authority over our lives. They make a difference in our lives, and we have to pay attention to it. But as she says, we dare not confuse them with each other, because that way lies madness. Then we forget that our nature two truths are not as powerful as our nature one truths. They're not as profound. They're not as authoritative. And Hannah Arendt is very concerned with the difference between fake authority and real authority. So thanks for bringing all that up, Joe. It's right on the money. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, it's very much the problem of facts versus values. In philosophy, values sort of means things which are sort of immaterial, like good and evil. Good and evil are not facts. You can't take good and evil and put it in a test tube and boil it down to its and stick it on the elemental table. It's not there. And people confuse facts with values all the time. You know, when they say, well, you can't eat babies. That's a value. The fact is you can eat babies. But of course, your values are very important to you. Your culture is built on values, which, well, they're not facts, they're immaterial. But I think, you know, one of the debates you get with the modern rationalists, they're always harking back to the evils of the church. And dear old Master N was always pointing out the evils of the rationalists. That the rationalists are behaving just like the medieval church. But, you know, this is something that happens if you haven't got adequate information. The problem with Oedipus on one hand was he's terribly smart, but he just didn't have the information. This was the thing. He had beautiful eyes. But what's the use of having beautiful, clear eyes when you haven't actually seen something? You're no better than the blind man. But actually, the blind man has an advantage. He knows he's blind. You think because you can see that you've got the answers always. But I mean, you know, when the modern rationalists are always laughing about the Pope arguing with Galileo, that argument. And they actually, they put it in the simplest of terms. And actually, you know, I was watching a documentary which pointed out actually this was a lot more difficult debate than people imagine. Galileo said his own, the Pope had told him how he could set out the argument. He could compare both systems. And Galileo just went and behaved most arrogantly and stuffed everything up for science. He wasn't serving science, he was serving his own ego. But this is the thing, when people come to this debate, and this is just something, I'm not the greatest mind around, I can guarantee you that, but astronomy used to be an interest of mine. And I simply know the information. I don't have the best eyes on the planet. I've simply seen what the issue is. And that's, I put the question there, why was there such a severe debate over the merits of the Ptolemaic system versus the Copernican system in the 16th to 17th centuries? And all these rationalists are going around, oh, it's such a prize, how smart us rationalists are, and how dopey were these medievals. Oh, let's put the gold cap on their head. Give yourselves the gold star. And if I was to give them this question, they don't know the answer. Why was the debate so severe? And this comes to today as well, the political questions now, where people will, you know, even the political class will openly state lies because it serves certain interests. They don't want to move on because there is so much skin in the game now. It's like there's so much falsification happening in the universities now because there's so much skin in the game. They're in there for the money. They're in there for the status. And if they admit they're wrong, they're going to lose money and status. So what's more important, the truth or my money and my status? Well, it turns out it's my money and my status, which is more important. But, you know, there's a lot of budding intellectuals out there. Why was that debate between Galileo and the Pope so severe? There were other elements there. And by the way, Galileo wasn't right. I mean, he dismissed Kepler, little humble Kepler who came along. Nobody mentions him. He actually figured out one of the key ingredients. Galileo was going, don't be silly. The circles have to be perfect. He was no better than the church. But, you know, do people have the answer? I do history, so I've got it. It's the reason why I've got the answer. Why was that question so severe? And if anybody can figure out the answer, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. There are some great books on Galileo and his trial, and I can tell Stephen's read some of them because some of the things he's saying, they were big exposés. There were fantastic books that came out that you know, went back to the transcripts and people's letters and so on, and they broke through this cartoon version of Galileo that we had, and they showed, yeah, he got some stuff right, and that was really important, but he also got some stuff really wrong. And why, when you read this stuff to find out why did he get right the things he got right, why did he get wrong the things he got wrong, that whole trial becomes more interesting. It turns out it stops being a cartoon version of a trial, and it becomes real history and real drama. It's why I wish our school system would spend more time teaching the history of science and not just the current conclusions of science, which is a far less interesting subject. The history of science, what these people were arguing over and what they were right and wrong about, is so much more interesting. And that's where we see all the things that Kenneth's talking about here, about hamartia and sin, right? Phil's in line, and I will be able to call on him in 10 minutes. So hang on to your point. Don't lose it. We're going to be interesting at you, but don't lose it, because it's going to be a good point, I'm sure. And in the meantime, let's dive along in paragraph 11, see if we can get through it today. So he just finished talking about sin and its etymological relationship to all these other terms, and now he turns from the term sim back to the term hamartia, and he says what is gained from its Greek form, hamartia, is that we know not just the results of sin, but its pre-formation. Sin takes its rise from the seductions of ego, from the failure to hew scrupulously to what is central or essential. And this is that sophrosune issue, right? In a nutshell. Because you could also say, from the Greeks might add what is central or essential or healthy for us, right? Where does the best vitality lie for us as an individual and or as a species, etc. And we don't hew to that because we can't detect that. We aren't like the cheetah that knows what it should be paying attention to. We don't know what we should be paying attention to, or rather, we do know, but we're wrong in a way that a shelf mushroom is never going to be wrong as wrong as we are. It's not that they don't screw up, but their mistakes fall somewhere within a reasonable set of choices, whereas we make wildly crazy mistakes. He continues, spirit unifies what exists, which, by the way, could be a powerful sentence all by itself without anything else. Spirit unifies what exists. This is obviously a different conception of spirit than the modern version. The modern definition of the word, this makes this sentence seem crazy talk. And this is one of the challenges in reading Kenneth Smith, is recognizing when you feel that jarring effect of a sentence like this, recognizing that what's at stake here is not, this doesn't become noise just because our definition can't make sense of this. It's more essential than that. He's saying there are different perspectives on the world. There have been different perspectives in the course of history, and from a different perspective, spirit means something very different than it means to us. And from that perspective, spirit does unify what exists. We probably won't be in a position to make sense of this sentence in the way in which Kenneth means it until we're like another year into our work on the medieval perspective, because the medieval perspective is going to explore spirit deeply. As you may recall, in an earlier paragraph, he said, the medieval epoch is the era of the realm of spirit. In the same way that to the ancients, the classical ancients, nature was the core organizing principle for the cosmos and human society. In the medieval epoch, the realm of divine right, in which you should only be king if God approves. Because if God approves, that means he knows that you will lead the people towards virtue and health by leading them towards God. Only under those conditions should you rule. That's a medieval idea. And that's an idea in which spirit is so powerful it becomes an organizing principle for economics, politics, and everything else. It's not just something people talk about on Sundays in church the way it is for us. He continues, and ego is merely the knife's edge by which flesh is determined to cut off its overweening portion of the world. This is such a Kenneth sentence, right? He's not saying, I, Kenneth Smith, believe this is literally true at all times and in all places. He's saying, here in a sentence, I'm giving you a deeply potent, electric, almost painful summation of the medieval perspective on what it means to be human. Sin, spirit versus ego. Can we set aside our ego and be empty vessels for the sacred to do the right thing? Or are we so full of ourselves that, like in the Zen koan, there's no more room to pour tea in our teacup? It spills over. we can't take in any wisdom because there's only room for, appetite and ego. And everything, every power we have, under that context ends up just becoming, a tool for taking what we want. And because we do it in a non-spiritual, that is non-healthy way, what we end up doing when we take is we take destructively. Our sin doesn't just cut our mind apart and our understanding apart, but it cuts the world apart. We damage other people in the world when we're led by ego instead of spirit. This is the core of the medieval critique of the ancient world. And when they're critiquing the late Roman Empire, this could sum up Augustine in a nutshell. This is their core concern. I love that Kenneth does this. When I read sentences like this, I don't just read the adult Kenneth, mastering his language and saying these profound thoughts. I also read the young adolescent Kenneth, who yearns to be a good writer, and he's impressed by Nietzsche's statement that Nietzsche wants more than anything is to say in 10 sentences what somebody else takes an entire book to say. And Kenneth's like, ooh, me too. I want to do that. I want to do that thing. Because to sum up the core of the medieval worldview in a sentence like this, from both the positive and the negative side, this is quite an accomplishment. I'm really fond of this. And then he wraps up these initial sentences saying, not to see what is spiritually vital, right? Missing the mark, lacking sophrosune, is to tie oneself off from the world and strangulate what feeds one's higher intelligence. The schism that's being created it's also you're dividing yourself away from the world. You're negating your relationships to the larger whole and to God and to everything else. I'll be able to call on Phil in a moment, but I think there's just enough time for Donald. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Wow, knife's edge. If you ask Kenneth, what do the Greeks mean by virtue? He will answer from Aristotle. The edge is the virtue of the knife.
Yes.
I wonder, when I saw that, I thought, that's interesting. I just can't believe that that's random. Why?
It can't be.
And that's kind of an unusual thing because all knives have edges. But if the edge is sharper or duller, it's more or less virtuous. You have to understand it's a two-level thing, the way that works for Aristotle. If it doesn't have an edge, it's not a knife. But it can have an edge and have varying degrees of virtue. I don't know where Kenneth is going. I was so glad when you said before that it'll take us a year to understand that sentence because I didn't even bother to highlight it. I just said, I haven't got a clue. I'm clueless. I'm glad Rick will take it up. I'll be here in a year when you can reconsider this sentence. Enough.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to smell in Kenneth's writing where I'm still falling short and where I can feel there's so much more going on. And that line in Aristotle about the knife's edge being the virtue of the knife, Kenneth knows that line like the back of his hand. There's no way he writes a sentence like this one without thinking about a sentence like Aristotle's.
That's the very example when I ask him about Greek virtue. He went right to that. And he's done that several times with other people and in classes. That's Aristotle's example that makes it so clear.
Yes.
About how you can have or not have a virtue, and if you have it to varying degrees.
Yes.
It's good.
It's good. And it really works to help us understand virtue in this ancient conception of the word, right? Because moderns Virtue is whatever you can get other people to admire you for. You just call that a virtue. Even if it's a terrible vice, it makes everything worse. But hey, they admire me, so this must be a virtue. And to the medievals, virtue has a lot to do with obedience to God. So this naturalistic concept of virtue is often, as we talked about in the first 2 years, it's often completely alien to people. They often have never considered this concept that virtue has nothing to do with God and nothing to do with approval and everything to do with what Aristotle says is essential. What's the core of the thing that makes it what it is? And so, how can it be a knife if it doesn't have an edge? You can dispense with a lot of other parts of a knife, but if you dispense with the edge, how can you even call it a knife? It's in exactly the same way that the virtue of the cheetah is its speed. That speed, without the speed, it can't live the life of a cheetah. And the knife without the edge can't, live the life of a knife. So, yeah, thank you for.
Well, if our ego functions like this knife's edge, I don't know. I think there's some irony there.
Yes.
That the ego is not the virtue we might think it is. I just don't know. I gave up on this sentence. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yes. It's this sentence is packed with irony, and it's a medieval irony. There is Greek classicists talk about how once they get past the surface of Greek philosophy and literature, they find underneath it this deeper level that feels to a modern like it's misanthropic. They have some things to say about Homo sapiens that are so negative that we start to, the classicists at a certain level of experience start to conclude the Greeks must just not like people. Why are they being so negative? And you have to go deeper than that as a classicist before you get to the level where you understand, no, it's ironic. They're not saying other people are stupid. They're saying, I myself, who am writing this sentence and have devoted my life to scholarship, am stupid. I get it now. This is about that self-criticism and not being satisfied and struggling to do more. And we see that here in this there's a medieval irony at work in this, where it's saying the things we pride ourselves on the most as our very bestest, coolest parts work against us. They hurt us and they hurt the world when they're not in service to, a Greek would say sophrosune, a medieval would say, spirit or God. If it's not advancing that, then it's doing something destructive. And this paragraph 11, remember, he started by defining the term sin in terms of its relationship to scissors. Schism is this cutting part. And now he's bringing it around to, we've flesh, which needs to be part of a larger whole to live harmoniously in nature, is instead cutting itself off in its attempt to cut off too big a share for itself. It says, I want all this stuff. And in the course of grabbing all this stuff, it has inadvertently cut itself off from the source of life and strangulating what feeds its higher intelligence. There's just so much going on in this paragraph. This is classic Kenneth here. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'll make it real quick. I can't express what I wanted to say because the workers are back. The pounding actually beneath my door. So I'll just ask one question. Is it still an irony if the knife is made of titanium? I mean, that's it. I'll try to remember, but it's a very complex thing I wanted to say. But the workers are back. They're pounding. Actually, I could feel the thunder on my feet. So I'll save it for another day. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to explore here around this. And if you're talking about a knife, you better be thinking about Maslow's man with the hammer, right? Because we're talking about human beings and the utensils we wield, and to what extent do we allow ourselves to be whole human beings who are related to one another and need one another, and to what extent do we instead turn ourselves into living utensils, reduced down to our use value? He'll come back to this theme over and over when he gets into modernity, but that's implied here because you've got this sharp knife of your ego, which is one of your tools, but inadvertently we're wielding it in ways that hurt ourselves instead of healing ourselves. And yes, Ginny, great comment. We don't have to be perfect, but can we be better? Right? And this comes to what Geneva's talking about is, yeah, if we're going to look at these downfalls that we've had, if we're going to look at these blunders, we want it to be from the perspective of how can we grow from this? How can we integrate this into our personality in a dialectic and learn from it and do better in the future? He continues with paragraph 11. It was a paradox apparent to Aristotle that, unlike the things of nature and materiality, the keen edge of acute intelligence only grows sharper as it is used. Doesn't grow duller, it grows sharper. It's the opposite. It is an analogous paradox in Christianity that whoever chooses the better part indeed gets the whole. And he quotes Luke 10:42, which some of you may know by heart. But again, he doesn't actually put the text here. He leaves it as a follow-up for the student. This is what Kenneth's always trying to do. He's not trying to give you a system of thinking. He's trying to point to the entire history, the great conversation, the entire history of debates and discussions and wrestling. And he's constantly referencing these other people for you to follow up and read. He doesn't want to pull you in and make a cult with himself at the center. He wants to turn you around and look out at all the possibilities and then to look inward at what you might do inside yourself and how you might grow and transform, which is indeed the whole point of this book, is to learn to see beyond the trap that we're born into, the trap of assuming that the way most people in our lives see things is the natural way or the only way or the best way. Instead, learning that there's so many dozens or thousands of other perspectives and that they too need to be investigated. We won't know what we're missing until we look into those alien foreign things and see what's in there. And if we don't know what we're missing, then we can't make an intelligent decision. We can't know that we have the best of all forms of government, contrary to what a certain prime minister said. So he wraps up the paragraph. Through self-denial, not against lower goods or desires, but against the dysfunctional mentality that cannot comprehend their proper place in the scheme of things. Through self-denial of that, one rises to a full and abundant life, which includes the lower elements, right? The synthesis. This is the bud, the blossom, and the fruit here. He's like, if you can give up the life of the ego without losing your ego. Instead, you stop being a slave to your ego. Your ego becomes a servant of the larger whole of your personality. But as long as you live the life of the ego, it prevents you from growing any further. It tethers you to a half-witted strategy of life. He says this paradox, and now we're coming back to Fred's comment about Kierkegaard. He says this paradox Kierkegaard would later articulate into sublime detail and nuance, that from its own perspective, a pagan or aesthetic life lived for the sake of feeling seems desperately to exclude the principles and perspectives of the spirit. But the ethical and spiritual life, from its own side, does not exclude the aesthetic. So the aesthetic/ego-driven life, that viewpoint is finite. But the other, the spiritual ethical side, that perspective is infinite, and it can encompass the other. You want to grow up in a way that doesn't kill the inner child. You don't have to negate the inner child to be an adult. Everyone who creates a dilemma in their lives between behaving like an adult or behaving childish has failed to understand what adulthood is. Adulthood incorporates the inner child and builds upon it and grows further. This is what he's saying here. That kind of egotism from the perspective of Kierkegaard, which is related to the medieval perspective, that kind of egotism is just a stage of development. And it has to be grown through, not escaped from, but integrated and grown beyond. And this is the point of this paragraph. And I'm gonna echo Fred one more time before we wrap up for today, because we're at the end of our hour, or 3 hours. But I'm gonna echo Fred again and say, in our studies over the next year and a quarter, as we finish up our investigation of the medieval worldview, Kierkegaard is going to be incredibly helpful. Incredible. Of all the post-Hegelians, He's the one who most wanted to integrate Hegelian dialectics with a Christian perspective. And he didn't want to integrate it with what he considered to be, the shallow Christianity of most Danes in his life, who he then attacked in his later set of essays. He wanted to get to the deeper Jesus teachings. What is the deepest, most wise part of medieval Christianity, and how do we incorporate that into Hegel's dialectic? So I will be reading a lot more Kierkegaard over the next year in order to try to help support the work that we're doing here in these sessions.
Oh, I'm going to tell that to Eric. I've been going to his meetings for like 5 years since COVID started. So
I'm so glad. It's interesting
but
stuff.
don't ask me the content of Kierkegaard.
Oh, he's tough.
Oh yeah, it's anyway.
Yeah. He focuses on the bud, the blossom, and the fruit of the mind. That's Kierkegaard's area. That's his thing.
But what about Kant, in your opinion? He's also into Kant, and has been doing Kant for over 10 years or so.
This Hegelian line arises in reaction against Kant. Remember Hegel's whole take is that Kant took us an important leap forward, but he was too mechanical in the way that he described intelligence. And Hegel wants to replace it with kind of the embryogenesis or the unfolding of intelligence over time. And so Kierkegaard is all of these guys are standing on Kant. If it weren't for Kant, there probably wouldn't have been a Hegel. So he's essential, but they're all focused on trying to grow beyond him. So anyway, with this, I guess we wrap up for this week. I hope everybody had a good time. I certainly did. And
thank you as always, Rick. David.
Thank you, Jenny. Bye, Sharon. Bye, Geneva. Bye,
Bye-bye.
Stephen. Bye, Phil. Bye, Donald. Bye, Ariel.
Bye.
Bye, Rissa. Bye, Mike. Have a good week.
Bye, Rick.
Bye.